Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring The Moon, Volume 2. The First, by Edward W. Ludwig. Duel in Black, by John Foster West. All Day September, by Roger Kuykendall. Tongues of the Moon, by Philip José Farmer. First Stage, Moon, by Dick Hetschel. The First, by Edward W. Ludwig. Originally published in Infinity, November 1955. Narrated by Trussel. The city was enchanted. It was a colossal music box, blaring forth 1,000 chants of victory. It was a rainbow torn down from the sky and poured over the earth. It was a magic nursery through which eager-eyed children swarmed to behold a sparkling new toy. 3 spacemen, 3 conquerors to be, sat stiffly in the back seat of a blue-bannered convertible. The car moved snail-like toward the Capitol steps, escorted by 100 bands, 800 flowered floats, and 10,000 marching men. In its front seat, standing, waving to the crowd, was Captain George Everson. Everson, the legless man. Everson, the bronzed giant whose first rocket ship had exploded at takeoff, and yet who had lived to walk on artificial legs, to build a second rocket, and to infect all the world with his square-jawed determination. It was barely 8 o'clock on this April morning of the year 1982, yet the onslaught against the spacemen had begun. Confetti rained on them. Breeze-filled flags dazzled them. Band music deafened them. The flow of shouting spectators dizzied them. It was a day when holiday hats and mathematicians' formulae, roasted peanuts, and ancient dreams were blended in a fury of joy. The magic wand that had enchanted the city was Everson's lunar lady. And it was like a wand, 1,000 tons of it, poised on the takeoff field on the outskirts of the city, its needlepoint nose turned skyward and shining silver in the morning sunlight. Tonight, at sunset, when the city was saturated with speeches and music and popcorn and prayer, the great rocket would rumble and belch flame and rise. Mankind would begin its first flight to the moon. So it seemed that the people of all the earth were basking in joy and hope, every man, woman, and child, with one exception. Geoffrey Simon rose from his bed, awakened by the rhythm of march music outside his small apartment. He shuffled sleepily to a window. He blinked at the array of flags and bunting that lined the street. The music became louder. He ran a shaky, withered hand over his wizened face, brushed stringy white hair back from his forehead. His lips curved in a grim half-smile. "It's starting," he murmured. "The day that should have been yours." He realized that he was talking to himself again. But although he was only 56, talking aloud seemed natural to him. It not only eased his loneliness, it also helped him to clarify his muddled thoughts. "Today is your last chance. Not tomorrow or the next day. It has to be today." The thump-thump of a bass drum was like a gigantic heartbeat shaking all the land. The blare of trumpets was a victory song, strong enough to live in the mind of a man forever, strong enough to silence forever the voices of fear and loneliness that might haunt a spaceman. "That's the music," Geoffrey Simon muttered. "That should have been yours." A crimson-lettered banner said, "Everson the First." What a mockery those words were! It was like worshipping an evil, false-faced goddess. The illusion should and must be destroyed. He jerked erect. He must move quickly. He must put an end to this cosmic lie. He dressed in a freshly cleaned, single-breasted tweed suit. His tie was hastily knotted. There was no time for breakfast. He strode to a drawer of his bureau, yanked it open, dug away a layer of underclothing. He smiled as he beheld two objects. His hands moved gently. His hands were like those of a florist arranging a garland of delicate blossoms. They were like the hands of a surgeon fearful of a fatal error. They were like the hands of a father upon his firstborn. He picked up the stone. It was a bright, phosphorescent green, mottled with flecks of gold, and no larger than an apple. Its glow seemed to fill all the room. Geoffrey remembered the cave at the base of Luna's Mount Pico from where he'd chipped it. The cave's eerie glow had almost seemed alive, quivering and pulsing with alien energy. Geoffrey, in his spacesuit and half-blinded, had staggered when he left with his specimen. Next he touched the photograph. It was a moment of eternity captured long ago and still imprisoned in a wrinkled, yellowed paper. On it was the rocket, the Marilyn, which had been his home for 15 years. Behind it, on a rise in the pock-marked lunar terrain, was one of the launching stations which had never been used. In the background loomed the nightmarish Tenerife mountains, and hovering above all in a sky of black velvet was a shining blue-green ball, the Earth. Carefully, Geoffrey placed the photograph in a large envelope and slid it, with a stone, into his coat's inner pocket. "They'll believe me now," he murmured. "They ignored the letters, the telegrams. Now, with proof, they'll believe. They'll learn what is a lie and what is the truth. They'll learn who was really first." A moment later he was on the street, struggling to filter through the crowd. For a few seconds he knew terror, because those in the crowd had surrendered all individuality. They had become a single automatic entity, hypnotized by the tapestry of color and sound and responding to it alone. The crowd closed in upon him like the tentacles of an octopus, imprisoning him and thrusting him forward and back. At last, panting, he broke free. He found a side street, one that would not be invaded by the parade. He walked swiftly. Then, although breath came hard, he ran. Carved above the entrance of the huge stone building were the words, "United States Bureau of Interplanetary Research." Geoffrey stopped to catch his breath. How many of his letters had passed over that mountainous series of steps? How many, like those to Congress, to the Pentagon, and to the President, had been crumpled, torn, tossed into waste baskets? It didn't matter. He was doing now what he should have done a month ago, appearing in person with his proof. He lumbered up the stone steps. His watery eyes widened at the bright murals in the vast foyer, murals of stars and planets, of rockets and spacemen, all centered about a gigantic and symbolic pair of human hands reaching upward. Geoffrey squinted down the white, clean, cool halls. So this was where the spacemen of today lived, studied, worked, experimented. How different from that battered Quonset hut in the hot, wind-burnt New Mexican desert. "May I help you, sir?" The voice snapped him back to reality. He turned and saw a young man seated at a desk a short distance away. The man was sleepy-eyed, with black, close-cropped hair and ears that were too big. On the desk was a placard that said, "Officer of the Day, Lieutenant Andrews." The lieutenant drummed his fingers on the desk. Speak up, old-timer. What is it? If you want information on today's flights, just help yourself to these folders. No. Geoffrey walked up to the desk, brushed away the folders. I want to see someone in authority. There's something I have to tell them. I'm in charge. Go ahead and tell it to me. Geoffrey trembled. It's going to sound crazy. You might not believe. Go ahead and tell it. Then I'll decide whether to believe. Confidence came to Geoffrey. He touched the reassuring bulge of the stone and the photograph in his pocket. Then he began to speak. Well, you've read how things were back in 1957. The world cut in half. Communism on one side, democracy on the other. Both sides threatening the other. Both building faster and faster jets and bigger H-bombs. People felt like they were walking on tight ropes. In August of 57, the Russians announced that they had the biggest H-bomb ever made. The President and his cabinet and the top brass met. The Army Chief of Staff was already on record in saying there was no perfect defense against an H-bomb attack. Radar nets, anti-aircraft, and fighter planes would take care of a lot of attacking bombers or missiles, but some would probably get through. There had to be something else, something as daring as the first A-bomb project back in World War II. The answer was obvious: a manned artificial satellite. The lieutenant stiffened. He made a sucking noise with his lips. Yep, Geoffrey continued. A manned satellite. Our scientists had developed the tiny unmanned mouse. A full-scale version was tougher, but possible. And a nation in control of such a satellite would watch over all the world. From its near-zero gravity, it could launch guided atomic missiles to any point on the Earth. Geoffrey cleared his throat. His listener was still attentive. So Project Pandora began. Like the Manhattan Project, it was top secret because we didn't want the Russians to start like crazy on their own project. I never learned how many men were involved. Probably about 100,000. But all except maybe 100 or so thought they were working on new types of jets or fuels. A new town, Pandora City, sprang up in New Mexico for general research. Really top secret stuff, like the construction of our rockets, was handled in Hell Canyon, which probably still isn't on your maps. You couldn't get there except by cargo-carrying helicopter. I was a guided missile man transferred from Point Mugu to the canyon. Entering that hellhole was like being sentenced for life. We had our movies and beer, but the sun and mountains were still there. I used to look at those mountains and wonder if I dared try to escape. Then I thought of the desert on the other side. There was no escape, except through death or by finishing the damn project. By the fall of 58, we had our fuel. Dilute monatomic hydrogen. Powerful as the guts of an H-bomb, but controllable, suitable for atomic engines. Powered with that fuel, a rocket could rip through the old 7-mile-a-second barrier like a knife cutting through tissue paper. Then a new question came up. Was the artificial satellite the ideal solution to our problem? Even at a height of 1,000 miles, it could be visible to Russian astronomers. Russian knowledge of our secret could start off a third world war. And if the Russians developed their own guided missile program, the satellite might be vulnerable. We'd developed an alloy of rare earths for our jet tubes. There was no reason why we couldn't hit the moon direct. A lunar station could be camouflaged, and launching platforms for missiles could be scattered. Most important, the moon would give us utter secrecy. Geoffrey's voice trailed. A cloud of memory seemed to drift before his vision. And I guess there was something else, too. We didn't want to stop with just a satellite. We had the power to take space by the nose and pull it around like a whipped dog. The first men to leave our planet. Think of those words. The first. The very first. The thought makes you a little drunk." He smiled. "The President, his cabinet, the top brass okayed our ideas. So the moon it was." Lieutenant Andrews rose, his mouth a tight white line. "Afraid we'll have to call it a day," he muttered. "It's time for me to go off duty. Sorry." But your relief isn't here. You can't—" "Sorry." The man's gaze avoided Geoffrey's face. He moved swiftly, his tall body easing around the desk, then striding down the hall. Geoffrey was like a statue, an absurd, bulging-eyed statue, with right hand still raised in a climactic, melodramatic gesture. "But I haven't finished," he cried. "You haven't heard." The lieutenant marched away, oblivious to Geoffrey's pleading voice. Abruptly, his bright uniform disappeared into one of the labyrinth's many rooms. Geoffrey was a fragile leaf mauled by winds of desperation. He dug furiously into his coat's inner pocket. "You haven't seen my proof!" he screamed. There was no reply, save the cold, hollow, hundred-tongued echo of his own words. Geoffrey looked down at his outstretched hands. They were holding the faded photograph and the shining stone, offering them to the silence. Outside, the city was like a merry-go-round, whirling faster and faster. Music had swelled to a dizzying crescendo. Colours were brighter in the noon sunlight. Voices were louder, prayers stronger. 10 to 1 they don't make it," said a rat-faced man. "I'll take all bets." "They will not be alone," the solemn man in the black robe intoned to his congregation. "For yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death—" "Why must Daddy go up into the sky, Mama? Why?" asked the child. "He's going to be a pioneer, dear. He's going to be one of the first to go to the moon." "But why, Mama? Why?" The bearded man shouted, "The wrath of God will fall upon us, and upon our children, and our children's children. Man was not meant." "We have our Marco Polo, our Columbus, our Wright brothers, and our Lindbergh. Now, by the grace of God, we have our George Everson." "Step right up, folks. Get your souvenir programs here, and don't forget your dark glasses for the takeoff. Special today, only $1. A clock struck 1. "No," said the stiffly polite girl. "The city editor isn't in. No, our reporters are covering the flight. Sorry." A clock struck 2. "Sorry." Geoffrey sighed. What else was there? The Research Bureau, the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, the Times, the Herald, the Post. He hadn't wanted to take his story to the newspapers, but they had given him a last futile hope. Now even they had refused to listen. There was still the Mirror, the Twilight News, the love nests, the exposés, the screaming headlines that most papers were saving for the second coming of Christ. Geoffrey found himself walking up dark, thinly carpeted stairs, pushing a faded swinging door. Then someone was leading him forward. Sounds of clacking typewriters and rustling papers filled the air. The photograph and the moonstone were in his hands. He was thrusting them forward. "This is my proof," he mumbled automatically. For a long time his surroundings were like the terrain in a dimly remembered dream. Then Hans helped him into a chair. A deep voice grunted at him. "Okay, proof of what?" Geoffrey blinked. His brain fought to break through the wall of weariness that had enclosed it. He saw that the man before him was middle-aged, balding, small-eyed. His trace of a smile was not unpleasant. "What's it all about, fellow?" the man asked, leaning back in his chair. "Thank you, God," thought Geoffrey, "that I have another chance." He began again. 1957. The H-bomb. Project Pandora. Lord, if he could only show this man the images that still hung in his memory. But how could you recapture the dizzying blackness of space, the hypnotic silver of stars, and recreate their magic in mere words? How feeble were words! They were like broken fingers trying to carry sand. Nevertheless, the man listened. Geoffrey came to the words, "So the moon it was," and even then the man said nothing. Geoffrey went on. "Our first rocket was ready by the summer of '59. We named it the Marilyn, after Marilyn Monroe, the top glamour gal of those days, and I was in the ship's first crew. Our takeoff wasn't like this circus today. No music, no speeches, no parades. We had a shot of brandy in the morning. We shook hands with our friends and puffed on cigarettes, and the CO said a prayer. Then we took off." Geoffrey weighed words and memories in his mind. "It'd take me a year to tell about how space looks and how the moon is, and how you feel when all the things you love are in a cloud-wrapped ball 240,000 miles away, or how it feels to see your buddies slip through the paper-thin crust that covers parts of the moon and go down into nothingness, just as if the hand of God wiped them out of the universe. Anyway, we hit the moon. The ship stayed long enough for us to build a dome. Then we split the crew in half. 5 stayed, the rest shuttled back to Earth for more supplies. 3 months later, the second rocket, the June Randy, was ready, and life got a little easier. We began to get an occasional case of beer and mail from home. Our families thought they were writing to Pandora City. To think that those little 3-cent letters would go all the way to Luna would have seemed a lunatic's dream to them. By the summer of '61, Project Pandora was completed. We had 2 domes and 4 launching stations, each 100 miles apart. The missiles on the launching platforms were like those beds of nails the yogis are supposed to lie on, only 100 times bigger, and each nail was a uranium-lithium-tritium-headed rocket. 1961 slipped by, and '62, and '63. There were a few aborted revolutions on Earth, a few moments of tension, but no war. A veil of loneliness seemed to fall over his vision, separating him from his listener. "Go ahead," the man prompted him. "Well, new faces appeared in our crews. The older fellows were given memory washes so they wouldn't start blabbing when they returned to Earth. Psychiatric was pretty primitive in those days. The treatment wasn't much more than hypnosis, creating an artificial psychic block in their minds. After a while, it seemed like men were coming and going like figures on a treadmill. But me, I stayed on." "You stayed on? Why?" Geoffrey thought for an instant. "Because there were 2 kinds of loneliness for us. One was being on the moon, in silence and emptiness. The other was being on Earth, in the midst of life, and knowing the biggest secret in the world, and not being able to talk about it. And of the 2 kinds of loneliness, to me, the last was the worst. So I stayed on the Marilyn." Geoffrey tried to keep his voice calm, his manner confident. "Then came the Russian Revolution of '74, the rise of democracy behind the crumbling Iron Curtain. The rest of the world watched and waited. We kept those launching platforms ready, just in case. But by '76, there was no doubt about it. Communism was over and done. The world was at peace. And with the arrival of peace, man's energies had to be directed into new channels. Till now, the government had quietly discouraged any talk about spaceflight. But now man craved adventure. Newspapers and public opinion began to beat the drum for that first flight to the moon. He chuckled softly. The president must have been tearing his hair out. What the hell was he going to do with Project Pandora? The Russians mustn't know that for 15 years our missiles had been ready to blast them to eternity. The old hates had been buried. They couldn't be allowed to rise again. So Project Pandora became Project Garbage. The domes and platforms were dismantled and carried back to Pandora City. The moon was the biggest garbage dump in the solar system, but it had to be cleaned up to the last beer can and cigarette butt. It had to become virgin again, ready to receive what Earth would later call the first pioneers of space. And it was then, when discipline was low, that I smuggled out the moonstone and the photo. Everybody got the memory wash, from the president on down. I was a civilian again, with a nice pension. For the first couple of years I couldn't remember a thing. I only knew I'd done secret work for the government. I'd look at my photo and stone and wonder where I got them. But gradually my memory came back. Maybe it was because of the photo, or maybe because I'd been on Luna and the Marilyn so much longer than the others. Last year I got mad when Everson announced plans to hit the moon. His name was in headlines every day. He was becoming a hero without even leaving the ground. And there were 100 men whose bodies were already lost on Luna. They were the real heroes, the real pioneers. This celebration today is a mockery. I want the world to know the truth. For the space of a minute, the small-eyed man was silent. His fingers toyed with the stone and the photograph. Finally he murmured, "Suppose I publish your story. How much do you want for it?" To Geoffrey, the words were like April sunshine streaking into a cobwebbed winter attic. You want to use the story? You believe me?" "I didn't say I believe it. I don't give a damn whether it's true or not. My job is to sell newspapers. I asked how much you want for it." "Nothing," Geoffrey said softly. The small-eyed man grunted. "We could flood the city with the afternoon edition. People are buying anything with a moon angle. The Russians wouldn't shout for joy, but there shouldn't be any harm done at this late date." His eyes brightened. "We might get away with it. We've got your stone. We could demand that Everson locate the place where you got it, and either prove or disprove your story. Why, that'd be good for months." He laughed. "What a damper we'll put on this celebration. We'll make the city seem like a morgue. It's a dirty, lousy trick, but by God it'll sell papers." Geoffrey leaned forward, squinting. "A dirty, lousy trick? What do you mean?" "Skip it." The man's enthusiasm was rising. He was like fizzing soda in a thumb-stoppered shaken bottle. "We've got to get this story in print. Hey, Marty, get the dictatyper over here. I've been waiting all my life to yell, 'Stop those presses!' Marty, stop those goddamn presses!" "What did you mean?" Geoffrey insisted. "How can telling people the truth be a dirty, lousy trick?" The small-eyed man laughed again. "You don't think folks'll like this story, do you? You don't think they'll feel like celebrating when they read this, do you? It's a cinch they won't start cheering you for what you did almost 20 years ago. Say, wait till Everson sees that moon pic plastered on my front page. There's an angle. A pic of Everson's expression. Hey, Marty, get me!" Restlessly, Geoffrey rose and shuffled to a window. One of the city's myriad parades, like a battalion of coloured ants, was streaming down the street. The small-eyed man yelled, "Come on, let's have that story again. This time it's for publication." Geoffrey didn't answer. Odd thoughts were stirring in deep recesses of his mind. "Come on, let's have that story." Geoffrey stared out the window, a faraway gaze in his eyes. Do you suppose I was the only one who remembered? There must be others. I couldn't be the only one." "Sure, there could be others, if your yarn is true. Maybe they've tried to tell and nobody believed 'em. Or maybe they're keeping quiet. Maybe they don't want to make dopes out of Everson and his men. Maybe they want to keep 'em heroes. Now gimme that story." He flicked a switch on the dictotyper. Words echoed in Geoffrey's brain. Maybe they don't want to make dopes out of Everson and his men. Maybe they want to keep 'em heroes. It's a cinch they won't start cheering you for what you did almost 20 years ago. The world has need of heroes, he thought. There's Luna, and then there are Venus and Mars and Jupiter and all the others. And, always, there are the stars. And between there are miles and years of darkness and loneliness, and courage is a candle flame too easily extinguished. Mankind will need songs of daring and tales of heroes and signposts to guide the way to infinity. You can't make heroes out of men whose very names are forgotten. You can't make heroes out of tired old bones. Geoffrey frowned as the hum of presses echoed in his ears. The great headlines would descend upon the enchanted city like a black tidal wave. They would swirl through the streets, devour the bright colour, absorb the gay sound, suck the joy into dark waters of doubt and suspicion. The small-eyed man was shouting at him. He did not hear. After all, Geoffrey told himself, this is for you. It's not for Everson and his men, really. It's for the pioneers, for those who dare to be first. The eyes are not on you, and the voices do not speak to you. Yet all this, really, is for you. For you were the first. Would you destroy this day that is yours? A voice was swearing at him. What a day it was! Why, it must be the greatest in the history of Earth. It was a day for all history books everywhere, always. It was a shame that the minutes were piling one upon the other so rapidly. How wonderful if they could be bottled and sealed like sweet perfume, to be dispensed slowly, a cent a month, a drop a year. Hands were tugging at his arm. He shook himself free. He turned back to the desk, seized the moonstone and the photograph, replaced them in his pocket. Silently, head high, he strode past the naked, astonished faces. Dusk. A silence blanketed the take-off field. The seconds hung in the air like bits of fire and ice. Captain George Everson, the man with no legs, waved to the multitude as he entered his silver rocket. Presently there was a sound of thunder, and the land trembled. Flame belched from the stern of the lunar lady. Slowly the rocket began to rise. The multitude drew back, like frightened red ghosts in the fiery glare from the grumbling jets. A greater avalanche of flame spewed from the rocket. A furnace-hot wind shrilled over the field, lashing at hair and clothing, at banner and flag. And suddenly the lunar lady was gone. It was a needle of fire high in the twilight sky, a vanishing target for 1,000,000 narrowed eyes. A hushed, reverent murmur rose from the field. A small girl in a pink party dress tugged at her mother's skirt. "Look, Mummy," she whispered. "Look at that funny old man. He keeps saying, 'This is for you,' and he's crying and laughing at the same time." The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Duel in Black by John Foster West. Originally published in Planet Stories, Winter, 1947. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Young Ron Cragg fused the edge of his claim tag to the metal vein in the quartzite rock with its heat gun. Then with heavy shod fingers he tugged at the small copper disc, but it remained firmly in place. "That makes you owner, according to law, Mr. Cragg," he murmured. In the lonely, rugged reaches of Luna's north country, a man had to talk to someone. "A real load, looks like. Richest uranium load I've seen in many a lunar June. Bring me a nice roll if some of those rotten claim jumpers don't." Automatically he grasped the hilt of his gun, loosening it in the holster. He sauntered toward the cathetred, parked near the southern rim of the small crater near the mouth of the gorge. He could see several purple nebulous space moths fluttering around the engine of his vehicle. Cragg watched them as he approached the machine. They dipped, fluttered, and weaved about the cathetred, many of them wrapping themselves about the warm metal of the engine and eagerly absorbing any heat present. They reminded Ron Cragg more of a translucent amoeba wreathing through the nothingness of space than moths. But some ancients had dubbed them moths, and moths they had remained. They ranged in size from the area of a man's hand to about 3 square feet. He knew 2 things about them. They could detect the slightest rise in temperature over a distance of 50 yards, and they did not like the intense, constant heat of the 2 weeks' lunar days. They apparently disappeared into craters and fissures during the hotter parts of the day and came out after the setting of the sun. "Good thing my suit and thermocubes are completely insulated," he muttered, "or there'd probably be about 10,000 of them wrapped around me, drinking up the heat." He dropped his hands to the 2 metal blocks built onto the suit high on each hip. Those 2 mechanisms were almost as important as his oxygen tank. They generated the heat conducted to the material of the suit and protected him from the 153 degrees centigrade of the lunar nights. Of course, he could last a while with only one of the units functioning. A man got into the habit of checking them during the long nights. His life depended on them and the oxygen tank, and sometimes the gun. The pale turquoise disk of Earth rode low in the heavens above the serrated Alps, towering above him, illuminating the rugged fastness in a sort of aqua glow. Earth, now at full, lighted Luna many times brighter than a full moon ever had lighted her. But the countless thousands of shadows cast by lava stalagmites, spires, boulders, and mountain peaks were pits of nothingness. Cragg walked into the Stygian blackness cast by stalagmite and disappeared as completely as though swallowed up by a dark hole in the moon's surface. He passed on through the shadow and reappeared abruptly on the other side. He himself cast a long black shadow, more weird because it appeared to be a black pit sliding over the floor of the crater. Instinctively, Ron Cragg crouched as the pencil of flame streaked past his head. He could not feel the heat through the insulated suit, but he knew it had missed him by scant inches. He wheeled and darted back into the shadow he had just quitted, his gun leaping into his hand. He saw a burly form dart into the shadow of a massive boulder across the basin from him. He started to snap a beam at it, but held his fire. The flare would only betray his own position. He could not see the slightest shape, the slightest trace of movement in the inky blackness of the other shadow. There was some compensation in knowing that the ambusher could not see him either. Without air to diffuse the earthlight, the shadows were sharp and distinct as though no light existed at all in the universe outside their borders. He glanced in the direction from which his attacker had come. There, in the north edge of the crater, in the mouth of the canyon, another cathetred was parked. It was an old model, battered and eroded by time and hard usage. Ron Cragg thought he recognized the steed. He had seen it once or twice down south, in the parking area back of the Tycho Terradome. Realizing the identity of his assailant, a sudden terror paralyzed him for a moment, but then it fled, leaving him trembling and angry. "Howdy, son," a sarcastic voice drawled into the earphones of his radarphone. "You shouldn't talk to yourself about your rich loads, else you should be sure your radarphone is cut off, so's poor luckless critters like me couldn't overhear ya." Cragg bit his lip in anger and shame. The killer had heard his remark, got a directional fix on his position, and... "Joe Braun?" Cragg grated into the transmitter in his helmet, forcing the quaver out of his voice. "Biggest, dirtiest claim jumper in all North Luna." "Nobody ever proved a thing on me," Joe Braun guffawed. "No, or you'd be at the bottom of some crater," Cragg retorted. "This time you've slipped." "Think so, fella? Think you'll be reporting this?" Ron's flesh crept. There were few men on Luna who would match flame with this black-bearded killer. Those luckless ones who had challenged him were now piled at the bottom of various craters. Cragg stared at the black shadow protecting his adversary, gripping his gun. But he knew there would be nothing to shoot at unless Braun shot first, revealing his position. And Joe was no fool even when he faced a greenhorn from Earth. Cragg was at bay here in the concealing shadow, helpless, trapped, and calling for help was out of the question. The radarphone would not carry to the nearest Terradome. The cathetred! If he could make a dash for the cathetred, reach it and throw a light beam into the shadows, he could burn the other to a crisp with a large swivel gun. But then a wave of despondency blacked out his thoughts. It was too far to the vehicle. Even with the lighter gravity of Luna to hold him back, his spacesuit was heavy and cumbersome, and he could never make it before Joe Braun would throw at least 3 shots in him. He would be a clay pigeon. Suddenly he realized the hopelessness of his predicament. He could never match flame with Joe Braun. Ron Cragg knew he did not have a chance in an open duel with a ruthless killer. "What's the matter, son? Afraid?" came the taunt through his headset. "I guess you know what the penalty is for claim jumping," Cragg snapped, "to say nothing of attempted murder." "Sure I do," Joe Braun laughed. "A great big pussy'll hunt me down and toss me into a bottomless crater. That's what happens to claim jumpers as gets caught. And you'll get a big fat reward, huh, sonny?" Ron bit back his answer. "But you named one of the charges wrong, son," chided Joe gently. "You called it attempted murder." He chuckled. "That's one thing old Joe Braun ain't ever going to be guilty of. Why don't you come out of that shadow and get it over with?" Cragg did not answer. He looked toward the cathetred. There was not a single rock or spire between it and him to protect him. The cliffs of the Alps rose sheer and precipitous from the level of the crater floor, and for most of the distance to the vehicle, the very base of the cliffs was brightly illuminated in the earthlight. But here and there a black shadow did jut out from the base of the precipice, cast by jagged peaks 8,000 feet above the tiny basin. Those shadows formed an irregular chain of black splotches over the pumice-covered floor between Cragg and the cathetred. Cragg wasted no time weighing his chances. Blood beat fiercely in his temples as he tensed. He darted out into the earthlight, then retreated back into the same shadow as a livid ribbon of flame streaked by just in front of his visor port. He knew it was excellent shooting for a handgun at that range. It would take Joe Braun 10 seconds to recharge and readjust the gun, and at that time, Ron Cragg darted out into the earthlight again and fled for the nearest shadow 100 feet away. He ducked into the blackness only split seconds ahead of another bolt of flame. If Braun only nicked his suit, his oxygen tank, or his thermocubes, it would finish him, and the gunman was getting his range. Joe Braun was out in the light now, dashing for the shadow of a spire nearer Crag's cathetred. Ron Crag raised his gun and pressed the trip. A bolt of flame cleaved space just behind the hurtling shape. A disappointed oath ricocheted about the close walls of Crag's helmet. He quickly pressed the charge poles of the gun against the battery post in his accessory belt and recharged the gun. He then turned the range dial to 75 yards, leaving the bolt diameter at 1 inch. He crouched in the shadow, peering across the intervening area between himself and his assailant. "Missed, son," Joe Braun guffawed. "Want to make it to your cathetred, eh? Well, two can play the same game." Crag swallowed an angry retort. Despair was again rising in him like a dense fog. Joe Braun darted for another shadow, drawing ever closer to Crag's vehicle. Crag took careful aim, but his hand wavered ever so slightly. He fired. A streak of flame reached out and nicked. No, it passed just to the rear of the fleeing man, a little above hip level. He could have sworn the bolt grazed the man's accessory belt, but no apparent damage was done. The huge man kept running and ducked into another shadow nearer the cathetred. If Joe Braun made it safely to the machine, he could turn the young prospector's gun on its owner and burn him down without effort. The next shadow in the chain was only 20 yards away. Crag covered the distance in 3 strides. Another bolt blasted space between his head and right shoulder. He snapped a bolt back in retaliation. It cut high and to the left. Crag glanced frantically at the cathetred. It was still too far away to reach in one dash. He knew he could never make it unless he hugged the shadows as he had been doing. Several space moths still clung hungrily to the cooling engine of the machine, but many of them were flopping and writhing frantically in space above the machine. They had detected the violent heat from the flame guns in the instant before their heat was dissipated into space, but that split second was not long enough for the creatures to locate the origin of the heat. They seemed frustrated, flopping desperately about in confused circles. Some of them fluttered into the shadows of the rocks and spires in their search, and their vaguely radiant network of veins squirmed like purple wraiths in the Stygian blackness. Crag's attention was suddenly yanked back to his predicament when Joe Braun darted for another shadow. Crag snapped another bolt and missed again. Either the bandit had plenty of guts, or he knew Ron Crag was really a poor shot. He did not hesitate in his advance from shadow to shadow toward the cathetred. It was a duel to the death here in the shadows. Ron Crag dashed to the next shadow without drawing flame. Apparently Joe deliberately held his fire, for the lighted area between this one and the next shadow was much further than Crag could sprint even in 10 seconds, and beyond the next one lay the cathetred. He crouched against the rock cliffs, glancing first toward the vehicle, then back at the black blot that he knew concealed the killer. There were only 3 more spires between Joe Braun and the cathetred, 3 more shadows, 3 more short sprints. Once the claim jumper made the machine, Ron Crag knew the duel was over anyway. Maybe his best chance was to wait here, aim carefully and take a chance on a lucky hit. But if he missed Braun in the first sprint, the man could make it all the way to the spire nearest the machine before Crag could recharge. And if he reached that last spire... Perhaps he'd better run for it after all, Crag thought desperately. But he knew with a cold certainty that the sure aim of the gunman could not miss him in the long sprint. Perhaps if he shot in Joe's direction just after he broke into the Earthlight, it might divert the killer's aim enough for a miss. He decided abruptly that it was his only chance. With trembling fingers, he checked the range dials on the gun. His tongue clung to the roof of a dry mouth. Crag crouched, darted forward, then halted so abruptly on the very rim of the shadow that he fell backwards and landed gently on both elbows. Slowly he got to his feet. His eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Several space moths were weaving through space toward the shadow of the pinnacle concealing the bandit. Crag stared, breathing more evenly now. More and more of the nebulous creatures were rising above the cathetred and moving straight as a plumb line in the wake of the leading moths. He stared at the inky shadows where he knew the killer lurked. The first 2 or 3 moths had already reached their destination. He could see their pulsating, irradiant veins curled around some object that had attracted them. More and more of the creatures floated into the shadow, disappeared for a moment, and then reappeared for a moment, and then reappeared as vague glow, fluttering toward the mass their companions had already formed. Ron Crag watched. The killer was apparently oblivious to their presence. Ron wet dry lips with his tongue, while his fingers slowly reset the dials on the gun. Range 60 yards. Diameter of beam 4 inches. Slowly he raised the gun and took careful aim. 8 inches to the right, 18 inches above the radiant cluster of space moths. If he was wrong, it was a gamble, and if he was shooting at the wrong space, Joe Braun would get him with a flare of Ron's gun. Even if he only wounded him, the other would get him. "Worried, fella?" the harsh voice began. A coruscating tube of flame leaped at the shadow across the canyon. For a moment it illuminated the area around the bandit in a brilliant glare. His taunting voice broke off with an agonized gasp. In the brief flash, Ron Crag saw the man twist erect, his empty hands grasping heavenward. He took 3 halting steps and tumbled into full view in the earthlight. A great charred hole was burned completely through his chest, and already the space moths were shifting to the wound, eagerly absorbing the escaping heat from the suit and from Joe Braun's body. Ron Crag slowly approached the crumpled form, gun ready. One glance at the sightless eyes, the bearded face and open mouth behind the visor port was all he needed to confirm what he already knew. Joe Braun had jumped his last uranium claim. Joe Braun had pulled his last gun. He leaned over the body, examining it closely. His gamble had panned out. One corner of the thermocube on Braun's right hip was fused, and a pinpoint hole was evident. The heat bolt Crag thought struck the killer's accessory belt had not missed after all. "I'll be a fork-tailed comet," Ron Crag breathed. He glanced affectionately at the squirming purple creatures. "Thanks, friends," he murmured. Then he set out on shaking legs for the cathetred.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. All Day September by Roger Kuykendall. Originally published in Astounding Science Fiction, June 1959. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The meteor, a pebble, a little larger than a match head, travelled through space and time since it came into being. The light from the star that died when the meteor was created fell on Earth before the first lungfish ventured from the sea. In its last instant, the meteor fell on the moon. It was impeded by Evans's tractor. It drilled a small, neat hole through the casing of the steam turbine and volatilized upon striking the blades. Portions of the turbine also volatilized. Idling at 8,000 RPM, it became unstable. The shaft tried to tie itself into a knot, and the blades, damaged and undamaged, were spit through the casing. The turbine again reached a stable state, that is, stopped. Permanently stopped. It was 2 days to sunrise where Evans stood. It was just before sunset on a spring evening in September in Sydney. The shadow line between day and night could be seen from the moon to be drifting across Australia. Evans, who had no watch, thought of the time as a quarter after Australia. Evans was a prospector, and like all prospectors, a sort of jackknife geologist, selenologist rather. His tractor and equipment cost $250,000. $50,000 was paid for. The rest was promissory notes and grubstake shares. When he was broke, which was usually, he used his tractor to haul uranium ore and metallic sodium from the mines at Potter's Dyke to Williamson Town, where the rockets landed. When he was flush, he would prospect for a couple of weeks. Once he followed a stampede to Yellow Crater, where he thought for a while that he had a fortune in chromium. The chromite petered out in a month and a half, and he was lucky to break even. Evans was about 300 miles east of Williamson Town, the site of the first landing on the moon. Evans was due back at Williamson Town at about sunset, that is, in about 16 days. When he saw the wrecked turbine, he knew that he wouldn't make it. By careful rationing, he could probably stretch his food out to more than a month. His drinking water, kept separate from the water in the reactor, might conceivably last just as long. But his oxygen was too carefully measured. There was a 4-day reserve. By diligent conservation, he might make it last an extra day. 4 days reserve, plus 1 is 5, plus 16 days normal supply equals 21 days to live. In 17 days he might be missed, but in 17 days it would be dark again, and the search for him, if it ever began, could not begin for 13 more days. At the earliest, it would be 8 days too late. "Well, man, 'tis a fine spot you're in now," he told himself. "Let's find out how bad it is indeed," he answered. He reached for the light switch and tried to turn it on. The switch was already in the on position. "Batteries must be dead," he told himself. "What batteries?" he asked. "There are no batteries in here. The power comes from the generator." "Why isn't the generator working, man?" he asked. He thought this one out carefully. The generator was not turned by the main turbine, but by a small reciprocating engine. The steam, however, came from the same boiler, and the boiler, of course, had emptied itself through the hole in the turbine, and the condenser, of course. "The condenser!" he shouted. He fumbled for a while until he found a small flashlight. By the light of this, he re-inspected the steam system and found about 3 gallons of water frozen in the condenser. The condenser, like all condensers, was a device to convert steam into water so that it could be reused in the boiler. This one had a tank and coils of tubing in the center of a curved reflector that was positioned to radiate the heat of the steam into the cold darkness of space. When the meteor pierced the turbine, the water in the condenser began to boil. This boiling lowered the temperature, and the condenser demonstrated its efficiency by quickly freezing the water in the tank. Evans sealed the turbine from the rest of the steam system by closing the shut-off valves. If there was any water in the boiler, it would operate the engine that drove the generator. The water would condense in the condenser, and with a little luck, melt the ice in there. Then, if the pump wasn't blocked by ice, it would return the water to the boiler. But there was no water in the boiler. Carefully, he poured a cup of his drinking water into a pipe that led to the boiler, and resealed the pipe. He pulled on a knob marked "Nuclear Start, Safety Bypass." The water that he had poured into the boiler quickly turned to steam, and the steam turned the generator briefly. Evans watched the light flicker and go out, and he guessed what the trouble was. "The water, man," he said. "There is not enough to melt the ice in the condenser." He opened the pipe again and poured nearly a half-gallon of water into the boiler. It was 3 days' supply of water, if it had been carefully used. It was 1 day's supply if used wastefully. It was ostentatious luxury for a man with a month's supply of water and 21 days to live. The generator started again, and the lights came on. They flickered as the boiler pressure began to fail, but the steam had melted some of the ice in the condenser, and the water pump began to function. "Well, man," he breathed, "there's a light to die by." The sun rose on Williamson Town at about the same time it rose on Evans. It was an incredibly brilliant disk in a black sky. The stars next to the sun shone as brightly as though there were no sun. They might have appeared to waver slightly if they were behind outflung corona flares. If they did, no one noticed. No one looked toward the sun without dark filters. When Director McIlroy came into his office, he found it lighted by the rising sun. The light was a hot, brilliant white that seemed to pierce the darkest shadows of the room. He moved to the round window, screening his eyes from the light, and adjusted the Polaroid shade to maximum density. The sun became an angry red-brown, and the room was dark again. McIlroy decreased the density again until the room was comfortably lighted. The room felt stuffy, so he decided to leave the door to the inner office open. He felt a little guilty about this, because he had ordered that all doors in the survey building should remain closed except when someone was passing through them. This was to allow the air conditioning system to function properly and to prevent air loss in case of the highly improbable meteor damage. McIlroy thought that on the whole he was disobeying his own orders no more flagrantly than anyone else in the survey. McIlroy had no illusions about his ability to lead men. Or rather, he did have one illusion. He thought that he was completely unfit as a leader. It was true that his strictest orders were disobeyed with cheerful contempt, but it was also true his mildest requests were complied with eagerly and smoothly. Everyone in the survey except McIlroy realized this, and even he accepted this without thinking about it. He had fallen into the habit of suggesting mildly anything that he wanted done, and writing orders he didn't particularly care to have obeyed. For example, because of an order of his stating that there would be no alcoholic beverages within the survey building, the entire survey was assured of a constant supply of homemade but passably good liquor. Even McIlroy enjoyed the surreptitious drinking. "Good morning, Mr. McIlroy," said Mrs. Garth, his secretary. Morning to Mrs. Garth was simply the first 4 hours after waking. "Good morning indeed," answered McIlroy. Morning to him had no meaning at all, but he thought in the strictest sense that it would be morning on the moon for another week. "Has the power crew set up the solar furnace?" he asked. The solar furnace was a rough parabola of mirrors used to focus the sun's heat on anything that it was desirable to heat. It was used mostly from sunup to sundown to supplement the nuclear power plant. "They went out about an hour ago," she answered. "I suppose that's what they were going to do." "Very good. What's first on the schedule?" "Mr. Phelps to see you," she said. "How do you do, Mr. Phelps?" McIlroy greeted him. "Good afternoon," Mr. Phelps replied. "I'm here representing the Merchants' Bank Association." "Fine," McIlroy said. "I suppose you're here to set up a bank." "That's right. I just got in from Muroc last night, and I've been going over the assets of the Survey Credit Association all morning." "I'm certainly glad to get them off my hands," McIlroy said. "I hope they're in good order." "There doesn't seem to be any profit," Mr. Phelps said. "That's par for a non-profit organization," said McIlroy. "But we're amateurs, and we're turning this operation over to professionals. I'm sure it will be to everyone's satisfaction." "I know this seems like a silly question. What day is this?" "Well," said McIlroy, "that's not so silly. I don't know either." "Mrs. Garth," he called, "what day is this?" "Why, September, I think," she answered. "I mean, what day?" "I don't know. I'll call the observatory." There was a pause. "They say, what day where?" she asked. "Greenwich, I guess. Our official time is supposed to be Greenwich Mean Time." There was another pause. "They say it's September 4th, 1:30 a.m. "Well, there you are," laughed McIlroy. "It isn't that time doesn't mean anything here. It just doesn't mean the same thing." Mr. Phelps joined the laughter. "Bankers' hours don't mean much at any rate," he said. The power crew was having trouble with the solar furnace. 3 of the 9 banks' mirrors would not respond to the electric controls, and one bank moved so jerkily that it could not be focused, and it threatened to tear several of the mirrors loose. "What happened here?" Spotty Cade, one of the electrical technicians, asked his foreman, Kowalczyk, over the intercommunications radio. "I've got about 100 pinholes in the cables out here. It's no wonder they don't work." "Meteor shower," Kowalczyk answered, "and that's not half of it. Walker says he's got a half-dozen mirrors cracked or pitted, and Hoffman on Bank 3 wants you to replace a servo motor. He says the bearing was hit." "When did it happen?" Cade wanted to know. "Must have been last night, at least 2 or 3 days ago. All of 'em too small for radar to pick up, and not enough for Seismo to get a rumble." "Sounds pretty bad." "Could have been worse," said Kowalczyk. "How's that?" "Wasn't anybody out in it." "Hey, Chuck," another technician, Lemon, broke in. "You could maybe get hurt that way." "I doubt it," Kowalczyk answered. "Most of these were pinhead size, and they wouldn't go through a suit." "It would take a pretty big one to damage a servo bearing," Cade commented. "That could hurt," Kowalczyk admitted, "but there was only one of them." "You mean only one hit a gear?" Lemon said. "How many missed?" Nobody answered. They could all see the moon under their feet. Small craters overlapped and touched each other. There was, except in the places that men had obscured them with footprints, not a square foot that didn't contain a crater at least 10 inches across. There was not a square inch without its half-inch crater. Nearly all of these had been made millions of years ago, but here and there the rim of a crater covered part of a footprint, clear evidence that it was a recent one. After the sun rose, Evans returned to the lava cave that he had been exploring when the meteor hit. Inside, he lifted his filter visor and found that the light reflected from the small ray that peered into the cave door lighted the cave adequately. He tapped loose some white crystals on the cave wall with his geologist's hammer and put them into a collector's bag. "A few mineral specimens would give us something to think about, man. These crystals," he said, "look a little like zeolites, but that can't be. Zeolites need water to form, and there's no water on the moon." He chipped a number of other crystals loose and put them in bags. One of them he found in a dark crevice had a hexagonal shape that puzzled him. One at a time, back in the tractor, he took the crystals out of the bags and analyzed them as well as he could without using a flame, which would waste oxygen. The ones that looked like zeolites were zeolites all right, or something very much like it. One of the crystals that he thought was quartz turned out to be calcite, and one of the ones that he was sure could be nothing but calcite was actually potassium nitrate. "Well now," he said, "it's probably the largest natural crystal of potassium nitrate that anyone has ever seen. Man, it's a full inch across. All of these needed water to form, and their existence on the moon puzzled him for a while. Then he opened the bag that contained the unusual hexagonal crystals, and the puzzle resolved itself. There was nothing in the bag but a few drops of water. What he had taken to be a type of rock was ice, frozen in a niche that had never been warmed by the sun. The sun rose to the meridian slowly. It was a week after sunrise. The stars shone coldly and wheeled in their slow course with the sun. Only Earth remained in the same spot in the black sky. The shadow line crept around until Earth was nearly dark, and then the rim of light appeared on the opposite side. For a while, Earth was a dark disk in a thin halo, and then the light came to be a crescent, and the line of dawn began to move around Earth. The continents drifted across the dark disk and into the crescent. The people on Earth saw the full moon set about the same time that the sun rose. Nickel Jones was the captain of a supply rocket. He made trips from and to the moon about once a month, carrying supplies in and metal and ores out. At this time he was visiting with his old friend McIlroy. "I swear, Mac," said Jones, "another season like this, and I'm going back to mining." "I thought you were doing pretty well," said McIlroy, as he poured 2 drinks from a bottle of scotch that Jones had brought him. "Oh, the money I like, but I will say that I'd have more if I didn't have to fight the Union and the Lunar Trade Commission." McIlroy had heard all of this before. "How's that?" he asked politely. "You may think it's myself running the ship," Jones started on his tirade, "but it's not. The Union it is that says who I can hire. The Union it is that says how much I must pay, and how large a crew I need. And then the Commission—" The word seemed to give Jones an unpleasant taste in his mouth, which he hurriedly rinsed with a sip of scotch. "The Commission," he continued, making the word sound like an obscenity, "it is that tells me how much I can charge for freight." McIlroy noticed that his friend's glass was empty, and he quietly filled it again. "And then," continued Jones, "if I buy a cargo up here, the Commission it is that says what I'll sell it for. If I had my way, I'd charge only 50 cents a pound for freight instead of the $1.40 that the Commission insists on. That's from here to Earth, of course. There's no profit I could make by cutting rates the other way." "Why not?" asked McIlroy. He knew the answer, but he liked to listen to the slightly Welsh voice of Jones. "Near cost it is now at $1.40. But what sense is there in charging the same rate to go either way when it takes about 1/7 of the fuel to get from here to Earth as it does to get from there to here?" "What good would it do to charge 50 cents a pound?" asked McIlroy. "The nickel, man! The tons of nickel worth $1.50 on Earth, and not worth mining here. The low-grade ores of uranium and vanadium, they need these things on Earth, but they can't get them as long as it isn't worth the carrying of 'em. And then, of course, there's the water we haven't got. We could afford to bring more water for more people and set up more distilling plants if we had the money from the nickel. Even though I say it who shouldn't, $2.80 a quart is too much to pay for water." Both men felt silent for a while. Then Jones spoke again. "Have you seen our friend Evans lately? The price of chromium has gone up, and I think he should ship some of his ore from Yellow Crater at a profit." "He's out prospecting again. I don't expect to see him until sundown." "I'll likely see him then. I won't be loaded for another week and a half. Can't you get in touch with him by radio?" "He isn't carrying one. Most of the prospectors don't. They claim that a radio that won't carry beyond the horizon isn't any good, and one that will bounce messages from Earth takes up too much room." "Well, if I don't see him, You let him know about the chromium. Anything to help another Welshman, is that the idea? Well, protection it is that a poor Welshman needs from all the English and Scots. Speaking of which— Oh, of course. McIlroy grinned as he refilled the glasses. Slanger, McIlroy, va. Health, McIlroy, man. Slanger, mord, bach. Great health, man. The sun was halfway to the horizon, and the earth was a crescent in the sky when Evans had quarried all the ice that was available in the cave. The thought grew on him as he worked that this couldn't be the only such cave in the area. There must be several more bubbles in the lava flow. Part of his reasoning proved correct. That is, he found that by chipping he could locate small bubbles up to an inch in diameter, each one with its droplet of water. The average was about 1% of the volume of each bubble filled with ice. A quarter of a mile from the tractor, Evans found a promising-looking mound of lava. It was rounded on top, and it could easily be the dome of a bubble. Suddenly, Evans noted that a gauge on the oxygen tank of his suit was reading dangerously near empty. He turned back to his tractor, moving as slowly as he felt safe in doing. Running would use up oxygen too fast. He was halfway there when the pressure warning light went on, and the signal sounded inside his helmet. He turned on his 10-minute reserve supply and made it to the tractor with about 5 minutes left. The air-purifying apparatus in the suit was not as efficient as the one in the tractor. It wasted oxygen. By using the suit so much, Evans had already shortened his life by several days. He resolved not to leave the tractor again, and reluctantly abandoned his plan to search for a large bubble. The sun stood at half its diameter above the horizon. The shadows of the mountains stretched out to touch the shadows of the other mountains. The dawning line of light covered half of Earth, and Earth turned beneath it. Kowalczyk itched under his suit, and the sweat on his face prickled maddeningly because he couldn't reach it through his helmet. He pushed his forehead against the faceplate of his helmet and rubbed off some of the sweat. It didn't help much, and it left a blurred spot in his vision. That annoyed him. "Is everyone clear of the outlet?" he asked. "All clear," he heard Cade report through the intercom. "How come we have to blow the boilers now?" asked Lemon. "Because I say so," Kowalczyk shouted, surprised at his outburst and ashamed of it. "Boiler scale," he continued, much calmer. "We've got to clean out the boilers once a year to make sure the tubes in the reactor don't clog up." He squinted through his dark visor at the reactor building, a grey concrete structure a quarter of a mile distant. "It would be pretty bad if they clogged up some night." "Pressure's 10.5 pounds," said Cade. "Right, let her go," said Kowalczyk. Cade threw a switch. In the reactor building, a relay closed. A motor started turning, and the worm gear on the motor opened a valve on the boiler. A stream of muddy water gushed into a closed vat. When the vat was about half full, the water began to run nearly clear. An electric eye noted that fact, and a light in front of Cade turned on. Cade threw the switch back the other way, and the relay in the reactor building opened. The motor turned, and the gears started to close the valve. But a fragment of boiler scale held the valve open. "Valve's stuck," said Cade. "Open it and close it again," said Kowalczyk. The sweat on his forehead started to run into his eyes. He banged his hand on his faceplate in an unconscious attempt to wipe it off. He cursed silently, and wiped it off on the inside of his helmet again. This time 2 drops ran down the inside of his faceplate. "Still don't work," said Cade. "Keep trying," Kowalczyk ordered. "Lemon, get a Geiger counter and come with me. We've got to fix this thing." Lemon and Kowalczyk, who were already suited up, started across to the reactor building. Cade, who was in the pressurized control room without a suit on, kept working the switch back and forth. There was a light that indicated when the valve was open. It was on, and it stayed on, no matter what Cade did. "The vat pressure's too high," Cade said. "Let me know when it reaches 6 pounds, Kowalczyk requested, "because it'll probably blow at 7. The vat was a light plastic container used only to decant sludge out of the water. It neither needed nor had much strength. 6 now, said Cade. Kowalczyk and Lemon stopped halfway to the reactor. The vat bulged and ruptured. A stream of mud gushed out and boiled dry on the face of the moon. Kowalczyk and Lemon rushed forward again. They could see the trickle of water from the discharge pipe. The motor turned the valve back and forth in response to Cade's signals. "What's going on out there?" demanded McIlroy on the intercom. "Scale stuck in the valve," Kowalczyk answered. "Are the reactors off?" "Yes, vat blue. Shut up. Let me work, Mac." "Sorry," McIlroy said, realizing that this was no time for officials. "Let me know when it's fixed." "Geiger's off scale," Lemon said. "We're probably okay in these suits for an hour," Kowalczyk answered. "Is there a manual shut-off?" "Not that I know of," Lemon answered. "What about it, Cade?" "I don't think so," Cade said. "I'll get on the blower and rouse out an engineer." "Okay, but keep working that switch." "I checked the line as far as it's safe," said Lemon. "No valve." "Okay," Kowalczyk said. "Listen, Cade, are the injectors still on?" "Yeah, there's still enough heat in these reactors to do some damage. I'll cut 'em in about 15 minutes. "I found the trouble," Lemon said. "The worm gear's loose on its shaft. It's slipping every time the valve closes. There's not enough power in it to crush the scale." "Right," Kowalczyk said. "Cade, open the valve wide. Lemon, hand me that pipe wrench." Kowalczyk hit the shaft with the back of the pipe wrench, and it broke at the motor bearing. Kowalczyk and Lemon fitted the pipe wrench to the gear on the valve and turned it. "Is the light off?" Kowalczyk asked. "No," Cade answered. "Water's stopped. Give us some pressure. We'll see if it holds." 20 pounds, Cade answered after a couple of minutes. "Take her up to—" "No, wait, it's still leaking," Kowalczyk said. "Hold it there. We'll open the valve again." "Okay," said Cade. "An engineer here says there's no manual cut-off." "Like hell," said Lemon. Kowalczyk and Lemon opened the valve again. Water spurted out and dwindled as they closed the valve. "What did you do?" asked Cade. "The light went out and came on again." "Check that circuit and see if it works," Kowalczyk instructed. There was a pause. "It's okay," Cade said. Kowalczyk and Lemon opened and closed the valve again. "Light is off now," Cade said. "Good," said Kowalczyk. "Take the pressure up all the way, and we'll see what happens." 800 pounds, Cade said after a short wait. "Good enough," Kowalczyk said. "Tell that engineer to hold up a while. He can fix this thing as soon as he gets parts. Come on, Lemon, let's get out of here." "Well, I'm glad that's over," said Cade. "You guys had me worried for a while." "Think we weren't worried?" Lemon asked. "And it's not over." "What?" Cade asked. "Oh, you mean the valve servo you two bashed up?" "No," said Lemon. "I mean the 2,000 gallons of water that we lost." 2,000? Cade asked. "We only had 700 gallons reserve. How come we can operate now?" "We picked up 1,200 from the town sewage plant. What with using the solar furnace as a radiator, we can make do." "Oh, God, I suppose this means water rationing again." "You're probably right, at least until the next rocket lands in a couple of weeks." Prospector feared lost on Moon. IPP, Williamson Town, Moon, September 21st. Scientific Survey Director McIlroy released a statement today that Howard Evans, a prospector, is missing and presumed lost. Evans, who was apparently exploring the moon in search of minerals, was due 2 days ago, but it was presumed that he was merely temporarily delayed. Evans began his exploration on August 25th and was known to be carrying several days' reserve of oxygen and supplies. Director McIlroy has expressed a hope that Evans will be found before his oxygen runs out. Search parties have started from Williamson Town, but telescopic search from Palomar and the new satellite observatory are hindered by the fact that Evans is lost on the part of the moon which is now dark. Little hope is held for radio contact with the missing man, as it is believed he was carrying only short-range intercommunications equipment. Nevertheless, receivers are. Captain Nickel Jones was also expressing a hope. "Anyway, Mac," he was saying to McIlroy, "a Welshman knows when his luck's run out, and never a word did he say." "Like as not, you're right," McIlroy replied. "But if I know Evans, he'd never say a word about any forebodings." "Well, happen I might have a bit of Welsh second sight about me, and it tells me that Evans will be found." McIlroy chuckled for the first time in several days. "So that's the reason you didn't take off when you were scheduled," he said. "Well, yes," Jones answered. "I thought that it might happen that a rocket would be needed in the search." The light from Earth lighted the moon as the moon had never lighted Earth. The great blue globe of Earth, the only thing larger than the stars, wheeled silently in the sky. As it turned, the shadow of sunset crept across the face that could be seen from the moon. From full Earth, as you might say, it moved toward last quarter. The rising sun shone into Director McIlroy's office. The hot light formed a circle on the wall opposite the window, and the light became more intense as the sun slowly pulled over the horizon. Mrs. Garth walked into the director's office and saw the director sleeping with his head cradled in his arms on the desk. She walked softly to the window and adjusted the shade to darken the office. She stood looking at McIlroy for a moment, and when he moved slightly in his sleep, she walked softly out of the office. A few minutes later, she was back with a cup of coffee. She placed it in front of the director and shook his shoulder gently. "Wake up, Mr. McIlroy," she said. "You told me to wake you at sunrise, and there it is. And here's Mr. Phelps." McIlroy woke up slowly. He leaned back in his chair and stretched. His neck was stiff from sleeping in such an awkward position. "Morning, Mr. Phelps," he said. "Good morning," Phelps answered, dropping tiredly into a chair. Said Mrs. Garth, handing him a cup. "Any news?" asked McIlroy. "About Evans?" Phelps shook his head slowly. "Palomar called in a few minutes back. Nothing to report, and the sun was rising there. Australia will be in position pretty soon. Several observatories there. Then Cape Town. There are lots of observatories in Europe, but most of them are clouded over. Anyway, the satellite observatory will be in position by the time Europe is." McIlroy was fully awake. He glanced at Phelps and wondered how long it had been since he had slept last. More than that, McIlroy wondered why this banker, who had never met Evans, was losing so much sleep about finding him. It began to dawn on McIlroy that nearly the whole population of Williamson Town was involved, one way or another, in the search. The director turned to ask Phelps about this fact, but the banker was slumped in his chair, fast asleep, with his coffee untouched. It was 3 hours later that McIlroy woke Phelps. "They found the tractor," McIlroy said. "Good," Phelps mumbled, and then, as comprehension came, "That's fine. That's just fine. Is Evans?" "Can't tell yet. They spotted the tractor from the satellite observatory. Captain Jones took off a few minutes ago, and I'll report back as soon as he lands. Hadn't you better get some sleep?" Evans was carrying a block of ice into the tractor when he saw the rocket coming in for a landing. He dropped the block and stood waiting. When the dust settled from around the tail of the rocket, he started to run forward. The airlock opened, and Evans recognized the vacuum-suited figure of Nickel Jones. "Evans, man," said Jones' voice in the intercom. "Alive you are!" "A Welshman takes a lot of killing," Evans answered. Later, in Evans's tractor, he was telling his story. "And I don't know how long I sat there after I found the water." He looked at the Goldbergian device he had made out of wire and tubing. "Finally, I built this thing. These caves were made of lava. They must have been formed by steam sometime, because there's a floor of ice in all of them. The idea didn't come all at once. It took a long time for me to remember that water is made out of oxygen and hydrogen. When I remembered that, of course, I remembered that it can be separated with electricity. So I built this thing. It runs an electric current through water, lets the oxygen loose in the room, and pipes the hydrogen outside. It doesn't work automatically, of course, so I run it about an hour a day. My oxygen level gauge shows how long." "You're a genius, man," Jones exclaimed. "No," Evans answered. "A Welshman, nothing more." "Well then," said Jones, "are you ready to start back?" "Back?" "Well, it was to rescue you that I came." "I don't need rescuing, man," Evans said. Jones stared at him blankly. "You might let me have some food," Evans continued. "I'm getting short of that. And you might have someone send out a mechanic with parts to fix my tractor. Then maybe you'll let me use your radio to file my claim." "Claim?" "Sure, man. I've thousands of tons of water here. It's the richest mine on the moon."
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. Tongues of the Moon by Philip José Farmer. Originally published in Amazing Stories, September 1961. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Fireflies on the dark meadow of earth. The men and women looking up through the dome in the centre of the crater of Eratosthenes were too stunned to cry out, and some did not understand all at once the meaning of those pinpoints on the shadowy face of the new earth, the lights blossoming outwards, then dying. So bright they could be seen through the cloud masses covering a large part of Europe. So bright they could be located as London, Paris, Brussels, Copenhagen, Leningrad, Rome, Reykjavik, Athens, Cairo. Then a flare near Moscow that spread out and out and out. Some in the dome recovered more quickly than others. Scon and Broward, two of the Soviet North American officers present at the reception in honor of the South Atlantic Axis officers, acted swiftly enough to defend themselves. Even as the Axis took off their caps and pulled small automatics and flat bombs from clips within the caps, the two Americans reached for the guns in their holsters. Too late to do them much good if the Argentinians and South Africans nearest them had aimed at them. The Axis had no shock on their faces. They must have known what to expect, and their weapons were firing before the fastest of the Soviets could reach for the butts of their guns. But the Axis must have had orders to kill the highest-ranking Soviets first. At these, the first fire was concentrated. Marshal Koslevsky had half turned to his guest, Marshal Ramirez Armstrong. His mouth was open and working, but no words came from it. Then his eyes opened even wider as he saw the stubby gun in the Argentinian's hand. His own hand rose in a defensive, wholly futile gesture. Ramirez Armstrong's gun twanged 3 times. Other Axis bullets also struck the Russian. Koslevsky clutched at his paunch, and he fell face forward. The .22 calibers did not have much energy or penetrate deeply into the flesh, but they exploded on impact. They did their work well enough. Scon and Broward took advantage of not being immediate targets. Guns in hand, they dived for the protection of a man-tall bank of instruments. Bullets struck the metal cases and exploded, for in a few seconds the Axes had accomplished their primary mission and were now out to complete their secondary. Broward felt a sting on his cheek as he rolled behind the bank. He put his hand on his cheek, and when he took it away, he saw his hand covered with blood. But his probing finger felt only a shallow of flesh. He forgot about the wound. Even if it had been more serious, he would have had no time to take care of it. A South African stepped around the corner of the bank, firing as he came. Broward shot twice with his .45. The dark brown face showered into red and lost its human shape. The body to which it was now loosely attached curved backwards and fell on the floor. "Broward!" called Scon above the twang and boom of the guns and the whoop of a bomb. "Can you see anything? I can't even stick my head around the corner without being shot at." Broward looked at Scon, who was crouched at the other end of the bank. Scon's back was to Broward, but Scon's head was twisted far enough for him to see Broward out of the corner of his eye. Even at that moment, when Broward's thoughts should have excluded everything but the fight, he could not help comparing Scon's profile to a face cut out of rock. The high, bulbous forehead, thick bars of bone over the eyes, Dantesque nose, thin lips, and a chin jutting out like a shelf of granite, more like a natural formation which happened to resemble a chin than anything which had taken shape in a human womb. Ugly, massive, but strong. Nothing of panic or fear in that face. It was as steady as his voice. Old Gibraltar face, thought Broward for perhaps the 100th time. But this time he did not feel dislike. "I can't see any more than you, Colonel," he said. Scon, still squatting, shifted around until he could bring one eye to bear fully on Broward. It was a pale blue, so pale it looked empty, unhuman. "Colonel." "Now," said Broward, "a bomb got General Mansfield and Colonels Amato and Ingress. That gives you a fast promotion, sir." "We'll both be promoted above this bank if an axe lobs a bomb over," said Scon. "We have to get out of here." "To where?" Scon frowned, granite wrinkling, and said, "It's obvious the Axes want to do more than murder a few Soviets. They must plan on getting control of the bone phones. I know I would if I were they. If they can capture the control center, every Soviet on the moon, except for the Chinese, is at their mercy. So, we make a run for the BR?" "I'm not ordering you to come with me," said Scon. "That's almost suicide. But you will give me a covering fire." "I'll go with you, Colonel." Scon glanced at the caduceus on Broward's lapels, and he said, "We'll need your professional help after we clean out the Axes." "No." "You need my amateurish help now," said Broward. "As you see," he jerked his thumb at the nearly headless Zulu, "I can handle a gun. And if we don't get to the bone phone controls first, life won't be worth living. Besides, I don't think the Axes intend taking any prisoners." "You're right," said Scon, but he seemed hesitant. "You're wondering why I'm falling in so quickly with your plan to wreck the control center," said Broward. "You think I'm a Rusky agent?" "I didn't say I intended to wreck the transmitters," said Scon. "No. I know what you are, or I think I do. You're not a Rusky. You're a—" Scon stopped. Like Broward, he felt the rock floor quiver, then start shaking, and a low rumbling reached them, coming up through the feet before their ears detected it. Scon, instead of throwing himself flat on the floor, an instinctive but useless maneuver, jumped up from his squatting position. Now! The others'll be too scared to move." Broward rose, though he wanted to cling to the floor. Directly below them, or perhaps to the side, but still underground, a white-hot tongue was blasting a narrow tunnel through the rock. Behind it, also hidden within the rock, in a shaft which the vessel must have taken a long time to sink without being detected, was a battle bird. Only a large ship could carry the huge generators required to drive a tongue that would damage a base. A tongue, or snake, as it was sometimes called. A flexible beam of straightened-out photons, the ultimate development of the laser. And when the tongue reached the end of the determined tunnel, then the photons would be unsprung, and all the energy crammed into the compressed photons would dissipate. "Follow me," said Scon, and he began running. Broward took a step, halted in amazement, called out, "The suits! Other way!" Then he resumed running after Scon. Evidently, the colonel was not concerned about the dome cracking wide open. His only thought was for the bone phone controls. Broward expected to be cut down under a storm of bullets, but the room was silent except for the groans of some wounded, and the ever-increasing rumble from deep under. The survivors of the fight were too intent on the menace probing beneath them to pay attention to the two runners, if they saw them. That is, until Scon bounded through the nearest exit from the dome in a great leap afforded by the moon's weak gravity. He almost hit his head on the edge of the doorway. Then somebody shot at Broward, but his body too was flying through the exit, his legs pulled up, and the 3 bullets passed beneath him and blew holes in the rock wall ahead of him. Broward slammed into the wall and fell back on the floor. Though half-stunned, he managed to roll past the corner, out of line of fire, into the hallway. He rose, breathing hard, and checked to make sure he had not broken his numbed wrists and hands, which had cushioned much of his impact against the wall. And he was thankful that the tongues needed generators too massive to be compacted into hand weapons. If the Axis had been able to smuggle tonguers into the dome, they could have wiped out every Soviet on the base. The rumble became louder. The rock beneath his feet shook. The walls quivered like jelly. Then, not the ripping upwards of the floor beneath his feet, the ravening blast opening the rock and lashing out at him with sear of fire and blow of air to burn him and crush him against the ceiling at the same time. From somewhere deep and off to one side was an explosion. The rock swelled, then subsided. Silence. Only his breathing. For about 6 seconds, while he thought that the Russian ship's stations outside the base must have located the sunken Axis vessel and destroyed it just before it blew up the base. From the dome, a hell's concerto of small gun fire. Broward ran again, leaping over the twisted and shattered bodies of Russians and Axis. Here the attacking officers had been met by Soviet guards, and the 2 groups had destroyed each other. Far down the corridor, Scon's tall body was hurtling along, taking the giant steps only a long-time loony could safely handle. He rounded a corner, was gone down a branching corridor. Broward, following Scon, entered 2 more branches, and then stopped when he heard the boom of a .45. 2 more booms. Silence. Broward cautiously stuck his head around the corner. He saw 2 Russian soldiers on the floor, their weapons close to their lifeless hands. Down the hall, Scon was running. Broward did not understand. He could only surmise that the Russians had been so surprised by Scon that they had fired, or tried to fire, before they recognized the North American uniform, and Scon had shot in self-defense. But the corridors were well lit with electroluminescent panels. All 3 should have seen at once that none wore the silver or Argentine, or the scarlet and brown of the South Africans. So? He did not know. Scon could tell him, but Broward would have trouble catching up with him. Then, once more, he heard the echoes of a .45 bouncing around the distant corner of the hall. When Broward rounded the turn as cautiously as he had the previous one, he saw 2 more dead Russians, and he saw Scon rifling the pockets of the officer of the two. "Scon!" he shouted so the man would not shoot him too in a frenzy. "It's Broward!" Coming closer, he said, "What are you doing?" Scon rose from the officer with a thin plastic cylinder about a decimeter long in one hand. With the other hand, he pointed his .45 at Broward's solar plexus. "I'm going to blow up the controls and the transmitters," he said. "What did you think?" Choking, Broward said, "You're not working for the Axis?" He did not believe Scon was, but in his astonishment he could only think of that as a reason for Scon's behavior. Despite his accusation about Scon's intentions, he had not really believed the man meant to do more than ensure that the controls did not fall into Axis hands. Scon said, "Those swine. No. I'm just making sure that the Axis will not be able to use the bone phones if they do seize this office. Besides, I have never liked the idea of being under Russian control. These hellish devices." Broward pointed at the corpses. "Why?" "They had their orders," said Scon, "which were to allow no one into the control room without proper authorization. I didn't want to argue, and so put them on their guard. I had to do what was expedient." Scon glared at Broward, and he said, "Expediency is going to be the rule for this day, no matter who suffers." Broward said, "You don't have to kill me too. I am an American. If I could think as coolly as you, I might have done the same thing myself." He paused, took a deep breath, and said, "Perhaps you didn't do this on the spur of the moment. Perhaps you planned this long before. If such a situation as this gave you a chance—" "We haven't time to stand here gabbing," said Scon. He backed away, his gun and gaze steady on Broward. With his other hand, he felt around until the free end of the thin tube fitted into the depression in the middle of the door. He pressed in on the key, and, the correct sequence of radio frequencies activating the unlocking circuit, the door opened. Scon motioned for Broward to precede him. Broward entered. Scon came in, and the door closed behind him. "I thought I should kill you when we were behind the bank," said Scon. "But you weren't, as far as I had been able to determine, a Russian agent. Far from it. And you were, as you said, a fellow American. But—" Broward looked at the far wall with its array on array of indicator lights, switches, push buttons, and slots for admission of coded cards and tapes. He turned to Scon and he said, "Time for us to quit being coy. I've known for a long time that you were the chief of a nationalist underground." For the first time since Broward had known him, Scon's face cracked wide open. "What?" Then the cracks closed up. The cliff front was solid again. "Why didn't you report me? Or are you—" "Not of your movement, no," said Broward. "I'm an Athenian. You've heard of us?" "I know of them," said Scon. "A lunatic fringe. Neither Russ, Chinese, nor Yank. I had suspected that you weren't a very solid Marxist. Why tell me this?" "I want to talk you out of destroying the controls and the transmitters," said Broward. "Why?" "Don't blow them up. Given time, the Russ could build another set, and we'd be under their control again. Don't destroy them. Plant a bomb which can be set off by remote control. The moment they try to use the phones to paralyze us, blow up the transmitters. That might give us time to remove the phones from our skulls with surgery, or insulate the phones against reception, or, maybe, strike at the Ruskies. If fighting back is what you have in mind, I don't know how far your nationalism goes." "That might be better," said Scon, his voice flat, not betraying any enthusiasm for the plan. "Can I depend upon you and your people?" "I'll be frank. If you intend to try for complete independence of the Russians, you'll have our wholehearted cooperation, until we are independent. And after that, what then?" We believe in violence only after all other means have failed. Of course, mental persuasion was useless with the Russians. With fellow Americans, well... How many people do you have at Clavius? Broward hesitated, then said, 4. All absolutely dependable, under my orders. And you? More than you, said Scon. You understand that I'm not sharing the command with you. We can't take time out to confer. We need a man who can give orders to be carried out instantly, and my word will be life or death. No argument? No time now for discussions of policy. I can see that. Yes, I place myself and my people under your orders. But what about the other Americans? Some are fanatical Marxists. Some are unknown. We'll weed out the bad ones, said Scon. I don't mean by bad the genuine Marxists. I'm one myself. I mean the non-nationalists. If anyone wants to go to the Russians, we let them go. Or if anybody fights us, they die. Couldn't we just continue to keep them prisoners? On the moon, where every mouth needs 2 pairs of hands to keep breathing and eating, where even one parasite may mean eventual death for all others. No. Broward said, All right, they die. I hope. Hopes are something to be tested, said Scon. Let's get to work. There should be plenty of components here with which to rig up a control for the bomb, and I have the bomb taped to my belly. You won't have to untape your bomb, said Broward. The transmitters are mined. So are the generators. How did you do it? And why didn't you tell me you'd already done it? The Russians have succeeded in making us Americans distrust each other, said Broward. Like everybody else, I don't reveal information until I absolutely have to. As to your first question, I'm not only a doctor, I'm also a physical anthropologist engaged in a moon-wide project. I frequently attend conferences at this base, stay here several sleeps, and what you did so permanently with your gun, I did temporarily with a sleep-inducing aerosol. But, now that we understand each other, let's get out. Not until I see the bombs you say you've planted. Broward smiled. Then, working swiftly with a screwdriver he took from a drawer, he removed several wall panels. Scon looked into the recesses and examined the component boards, functional blocks, and wires which jammed the interior. I don't see any explosives, Scon said. Good, said Broward. Neither will the Russians, unless they measure the closeness of the walls to the equipment. The explosive is spread out over the walls in a thin layer which is colored to match the original green. Also, thin strips of a chemical are glued to the walls. This chemical is temperature sensitive. When the transmitters are operating and reach maximum radiation of heat, the strips melt, and the chemicals released interact with the explosive, detonate it. Ingenious, said Scon somewhat sourly. We don't. And he stopped. Have such stuff? No wonder. As far as I know, the detonator and explosive were made here on the moon, in our labs at Clavius. If you would get into this room without being detected, and could also smuggle all that stuff from Clavius, then the Russ can be beaten, said Scon. Now Broward was surprised. You doubted they could? Never. But all the odds were on their side, and you know what a conditioning they give us from the day we enter kindergarten. Yes, the picture of the all-knowing, all-powerful Russian backed by the force of destiny itself, the inevitable rolling forward and unfolding of history as expounded by the great prophet, the only prophet, Marx. But it's not true. They're human. They replaced the panels and the screwdriver and left the room. Just as they entered the hall and the door swung shut behind them, they heard the thumps of boots and shouts. Scon had just straightened up from putting the key back into the dead officer's pocket when 6 Russians trotted around the corner. Their officer was carrying a burp gun, the others automatic rifles. "Don't shoot," yelled Scon in Russian. "Americans, USAF." The captain, whom both Americans had seen several times before, lowered her burper. "It's fortunate that I recognized you," she said. "We just killed 3 Axes who were dressed in Russian uniforms. They shot 4 of my men before we cut them down. I wasn't about to take a chance you might not be in disguise too." She gestured at the dead man. "The Axes got them too?" "Yes," said Scon. "But I don't know if any Axes are in there." He pointed at the door to the control room. "If there were, we'd all be screaming with pain," said the captain. "Anyway, they would have had to take the key from the officer on guard." She looked suspiciously at the 2, but Scon said, "You'll have to search him. I didn't touch him, of course." She dropped to one knee and unbuttoned the officer's inner coat pocket, which Scon had not neglected to rebutton after replacing the key. Rising with the key, she said, "I think you 2 must go back to the dome." Scon's face did not change expression at this evidence of distrust. Broward smiled slightly. "By the way," she said, "what are you doing here?" "We escaped from the dome," said Broward. "We heard firing down this way, and we thought we should protect our rear before going back into the dome. We found dead Russians, but we never did see the enemy. They must have been the ones you ran into." "Perhaps," she said. "You must go. You know the rules. No unauthorized personnel near the BR." "No non-Russians anyway," said Scon flatly. "I know, but this is an emergency." "You must go," she said, raising the barrel of her gun. She did not point it at them, but they did not doubt she would. Scon turned and strode off, Broward following. When they had turned the first corner, Scon said, "We must leave the base on the first excuse. We have to get back to Clavius." "So we can start our own war?" "Not necessarily. Just declare independence. The Russ may have their belly full of death." "Why not wait until we find out what the situation on Earth is? If the Russians have any strength left on Earth, we may be crushed." "Now," said Scon. "If we give the Russ and the Chinese time to recover from the shock, we lose our advantage." "Things are going too fast for me too," said Broward. "I haven't time or ability to think straight now, but I have thought of this. Earth could be wiped out. If so, we on the moon are the only human beings left alive in the universe, and—" "There are the Martian colonies, and the Ganymedean and Mercutian bases." "We don't know what's happened to them. Why start something which may end the entire human species? Perhaps ideology should be subordinated for survival. We need every man and woman, every—" "We must take the chance that the Russians and Chinese won't care to risk making Homo sapiens extinct. They'll have to cooperate. Let us go free. We don't have time to talk. Act now. Talk after it's all over." But Scon did not stop talking. During their passage through the corridors, he made one more statement. "The key to peace on the moon, and the control of this situation, is the Zemlya." Broward was puzzled. He knew Scon was referring to the Brobdingnagian interstellar exploration vessel which had just been built and outfitted, and was now orbiting around Earth. The Zemlya, Russian for Earth, had been scheduled to leave within a few days for its 10-year voyage to Alpha Centaurus and perhaps the stars beyond. What the Zemlya could have to do with establishing peace on the moon was beyond Broward, and Scon did not seem disposed to explain. Just then they passed a full-length mirror, and Broward saw their images. Scon looked like a mountain of stone walking, and he, Broward thought, he himself looked like a man of leather. His shorter image, dark brown where the skin showed, his head shaven so the naked skull seemed to be overlaid with leather, his brown eyes contrasting with the rock-pale eyes of Scon, his lips so thick compared with Scon's, which were like a thin groove cut into granite. Leather against stone. Stone could outwear leather, but leather was more flexible. Was the analogy, as so many, false, or only partly true? Broward tended to think in analogies, Scon directly. At the moment, a man like Scon was needed, practical, quick reacting, but like so many practical men, impractical when it came to long-range and philosophical thinking. Not much at extrapolation beyond the immediate. Broward would follow him up to a point. Then they came to the entrance to the dome. Only the sound of voices came from it. Together they stuck their heads around the side of the entrance, and they saw many dead, some wounded, a few men and women standing together near the center of the floor. All except one were in the variously colored and marked uniforms of the Soviet republics. The exception was a tall man in the silver dress uniform of Argentine. His right arm hung limp and bloody. His skin was grey. "Colonel Lawrence," said Scon. "We've one prisoner at least." After shouting to those within the dome not to fire, the two walked in. Major Panchurin, the highest-ranking Russian survivor, lifted a hand to acknowledge the salute. He was too busy talking over the bone phone to say anything to them. The two examined the dome. The visiting delegation of Axis officers was dead, except for Lawrence. The Russians left standing numbered 6, the Chinese 4, the Europeans 1, the Arabic 2, the Indian East Asiatic none. There were 4 Americans alive: Broward, Scon, Captain Nashdoy, and a badly wounded woman, Major Herbal. Broward walked towards Herbal to examine her. Before he could do anything, the Russian doctor, Titiev, rose from her side. He said, "I'm sorry, Captain, she isn't going to make it." Broward looked around the dome and made a remark which must, at the time, have seemed irrelevant to Titiev. "Only 3 women left. If the ratio is the same on the rest of the moon, we've a real problem." Scon had followed Broward. After Titiev had left, and after making sure their bone phones were not on, Scon said in a low voice, "There were 75 Russians stationed here. I doubt if there are over 40 left in the entire base. I wonder how many in Pushkin." Pushkin was the base on the other side of the moon. They walked back to the group around Panchurin and turned on their phones so they could listen in. Panchurin's skin paled, his eyes widened, his hands raised protestingly. "No, no," he moaned out loud. "What is it?" said Scon, who had heard only the last 3 words coming in through the device implanted in his skull. Panchurin turned a suddenly old-faced to him. "The commander of the Zemlya says that the Argentinians have set off an undetermined number of cobalt bombs, more than 20 at the very least." He added, "The Zemlya is leaving its orbit. It intends to establish a new one around the moon. It won't leave until we evaluate our situation, if then." Every Soviet in the room looked at Lawrence. The Argentinian straightened up from his weary slump and summoned all the strength left in his bleeding body. He spoke in Russian so all would understand. "We told you, pigs, we would take the whole world with us before we'd bend our necks to the communist yoke," he shouted. At that moment, his gaunt, high-cheekboned face with its long upper lip, thin lip-line moustache, and fanatical blue eyes made him resemble the dictator of his country, Felipe Howard's, El Macho, the sledgehammer. Panchurin ordered 2 soldiers and the doctor to take him to the jail. "I would like to kill the beast now," he said, "but he may have valuable information. Make sure he lives, for the time being." Then Panchurin looked upwards again to Earth, hanging only a little distance above the horizon. The others also stared. Earth, dark now, except for steady glares here and there, forest fires and cities, probably, which would burn for days, perhaps weeks. Then, when the fires died out, the embers cooled. No more fire, no more vegetation, no more animals, no more human beings. not for centuries. Suddenly Panchurin's face crumbled, tears flowed, and he began sobbing loudly, rackingly. The others could not withstand this show of grief. They understood now. The shock had worn off enough to allow sorrow to have its way. Grief ran through them like fire through the forests of their native homes. Broward, also weeping, looked at Scon and could not understand. Scon, alone among the men and women under the dome and the earth, was not crying. His face was as impassive as the slope of a moon mountain. Scon did not wait for Panchurin to master himself, to think clearly. He said, "I request permission to return to Clavia, sir." Panchurin could not speak. He could only nod his head. "Do you know what the situation is at Clavius?" said Scon relentlessly. Panchurin managed a few words. "Some missiles, Axis base, came close, but no damage. Intercepted." Scon saluted, turned, and beckoned to Broward and Nashdoi. They followed him to the exit to the fields. Here Scon made sure that the air-retaining and gamma-ray and sun-deflecting force field outside the dome was on. Then the North Americans stepped outside onto the field without their spacesuits. They had done this so many times they no longer felt the fear and helplessness first experienced upon venturing from the protecting walls into what seemed empty space. They entered their craft, and Scon took over the controls. After identifying himself to the control tower, Scon lifted the dish and brought it to the very edge of the force field. He put the controls on automatic. The field disappeared for the 2 seconds necessary for the craft to pass the boundary, and the dish, impelled by its own power and by the push of escaping air, shot forward. Behind them, the faint flicker indicating the presence of the field returned, and the escaped air formed brief and bright streamers that melted under the full impact of the sun. "That's something that will have to be rectified in the future," said Scon. "It's an inefficient, air-wasting method. We're not so long on power we can use it to make more air every time a dish enters or leaves a field." He returned on the RT, contacted Clavius, told them they were coming in. To the operator he said, "Pay, how are things going?" "We're still at battle stations, sir, though we doubt there will be any more attacks. Both the Argentinian and South African bases were wrecked. They don't have any retaliatory capabilities, but survivors may be left deep underground. We've received no orders from Eratosthenes to dispatch searchers to look for survivors. The base at Pushkin doesn't answer. It must—" There was a crackling and a roar. When the noise died down, a voice in Russian said, "This is Eratosthenes. You will refrain from further radio communication until permission is received to resume. Acknowledge." "Colonel Scon on the United Soviet America's force destroyer Brown. Order acknowledge." He flipped the switch off. To Broward he said, "Damn Ruskies are starting to clamp down already, but they're rattled. Did you notice I was talking to Pei in English, and they didn't say a thing about that? I don't think they'll take much effective action or start any witch hunts until they recover fully from the shock and have a chance to evaluate. Tell me, is Nashdoi one of you Athenians?" Broward looked at Nashdoi, who was slumped on a seat at the other end of the bridge. She was not within earshot of a low voice. "No," said Broward. "I don't think she's anything but a lukewarm Marxist. She's a member of the party, of course. Who on the moon isn't? But like so many scientists here, she takes a minimum interest in ideology, just enough not to be turned down when she applied for psychological research here. She was married, you know. Her husband was called back to Earth only a little while ago. No one knew if it was for the reasons given, or if he'd done something to displease the Ruskies or arouse their suspicions. You know how it is. You're called back, and maybe you're never heard of again." "What other way is there?" said Scon, "although I don't like the Rusky dictating the fate of any American." "Yes," said Broward. He looked curiously at Scone, thinking of what a mass of contradictions, from his viewpoint, existed inside that massive head. Scone believed thoroughly in the Soviet system, except for one thing. He was a nationalist. He wanted an absolutely independent North American republic, one which would reassert its place as the strongest in the world. And that made him dangerous to the Russians and the Chinese. America had fallen, prey more to its own softness and confusion than through machinations of the Soviets. Then, in the turbulent, bloody, starving years that followed the fall with their purges, uprisings, savage repressions, mass transportations to Siberia and other areas, importation of other nationalities to create division, and bludgeoning propaganda and re-education, only the strong and the intelligent survived. Scone, Broward, and Nashtoy were of the second generation born after the fall of Canada and the United States. They had been born and had lived because their parents were flexible, hardy, and quick, and because they had inherited and improved these qualities. The Americans had become a problem to the Russians and to the Chinese. Those Americans transported to Siberia had, together with other nationalities brought to that area, performed miracles with the harsh climate and soil, had made a garden. But they had become Siberians, not too friendly with the Russians. China to the south, looking for an area in which to dump their excess population, had protested at the bringing in of other nationalities. Russia's refusal to permit Chinese entry had been one more added to the long list of grievances felt by China towards her elder brother in the Marx family. And on the North American continent, the American communists had become another trial to Moscow. Russia, rich with loot from the US, had become fat. The lean, underfed, hungry Americans, using the party to work within, had alarmed the Russians with their increasing power and influence. Moreover, America had recovered, was again a great industrial empire. Ostensibly under Russian control, the Americans were pushing and pressuring subtly, and not so subtly, to get their own way. Moscow had to resist being Uncle Samified. To complicate the world picture, thousands of North Americans had taken refuge during the fall of their country in Argentine, and there the energetic and tough-minded Yanks, the soft and foolish, died on the way or after reaching Argentine, followed the path of thousands of Italians and Germans who had fled there long ago. They became rich and powerful. Felipe Howard's El Macho was part Argentinian Spanish, part German, part American. The South African, sub-Saharan peoples had ousted their communist and fascist rulers because they were white or white-influenced. Pan-Africanism was their motto. Recently, the South African Confederation had formed an alliance with Argentine, and the Axis had warned the Soviets that they must cease all underground activities in Axis countries, cease at once the terrible economic pressures and discriminations against them, and treat them as full partners in the nation of the world. If this were not done, and if a war started, the Argentinians saw the country was about to be crushed, they would explode cobalt bombs, rather death than dishonor. The Soviets knew the temper of the proud and arrogant Argentinians. They had seemed to capitulate. There was a conference among the heads of the leading Soviets and Axis. Peaceful coexistence was being talked about. But apparently the Axis had not swallowed this phrase as others had once swallowed it, and they had decided on a desperate move. Having cheap lithium bombs and photon compressors and the means to deliver them with gravitomagnetic drives, the Axis was as well armed as their foes. Perhaps their thought must have been, if they delivered the first blow, their anti-missiles could intercept enough Soviet missiles so that the few that did get through would do a minimum of damage. Perhaps. No one really knew what caused the Axis to start the war. Whatever the decision of the Axis had put on a good show. One of its features was a visit by the Moon officers to the base at Eratosthenes, their first presumably in a series of reciprocal visits and parties to toast the new amiable relations. Result: a dying Earth and a torn Moon. Broward belonged to that small underground which neither believed in the old Soviet nor the old capitalist system. It wanted a form of government based on the ancient Athenian method of democracy on the local level and a loose confederation on the world level. All national boundaries would be abolished. Such considerations, thought Broward, must be put aside for the time being. Getting independence of the Russians, getting rid of the hellish bone phones, was the thing to do now. Or so it had seemed to him. But would not that inevitably lead to war and the destruction of all of humanity? Would it not be better to work with the other Soviets and hope that eventually the communist ideal could be subverted and the Athenian established? With communities so small, the modified Athenian form of government would be workable. Later, after the Moon colonies increased in size and population, means could be found for working out intercolonial problems. Or perhaps, thought Broward, watching the monolithic Scon, Scon did not really intend to force the other Soviets to cooperate. Perhaps he hoped they would fight to the death, and the North American base alone would be left to repopulate the world. Broward, said Scon, go sound out Nashdoi. Do it subtly. Wise as a serpent, subtle as a dove, said Broward. Or is it the other way around? Scon lifted his eyebrows. Never heard that before. From what book? Broward walked away without answering. It was significant that Scon did not know the source of the quotation. The Old and New Testaments were allowed reading only for select scholars. Broward had read an illicit copy, had put his freedom and life in jeopardy by reading it. But that was not the point here. The thought that occurred to him was that, nationality and race aside, the people on the Moon were a rather homogeneous group. 3/4 of them were engineers or scientists of high standing, therefore had high IQs. They were descended from ancestors who had proved their toughness and good genes by surviving through the last 100 years. They were all either agnostics or atheists, or supposed to be so. There would not be any religious differences to split them. They were all in superb health, otherwise they would not be here. No diseases among them, not even the common cold. They would all make good breeding stock. Moreover, with recent advances in genetic manipulation, defective genes could be eliminated electrochemically. Such a manipulation had not been possible on Earth with its vast population where babies were being born faster than defective genes could be wiped out. But here, where there were so few, perhaps it would be better to allow the Soviet system to exist for now. Later, use subtle means to bend it toward the desired goal. No! The system was based on too many falsities, among which the greatest was dialectical materialism. As long as the corrupt base existed, the structure would be corrupt. Broward sat down by Ingrid Nashdoi. She was a short, dark and petite woman of about 33, not very good-looking, but usually witty and vivacious. Now she stared at the floor, her face frozen. "I'm sorry about Jim," he said, "but we don't have time to grieve now. Later, perhaps." She did not look at him, but replied in a low, halting voice, "He may have been dead before the war started. I never even got to say goodbye to him. You know what that means, what it probably did mean." "I don't think they got anything out of him. Otherwise you and I would have been arrested too." He jerked his head towards Scon and said, "He doesn't know you're one of us. I want him to think you're a candidate for the nationalists. After this struggle with the Russ is over, we may need someone who can report on him. Think you can do it?" She nodded her head, and Broward returned to Scon. "She hates the Russians," he said. "You know they took her husband away. She doesn't know why, but she hates Ivan's guts." "Good. Ah, here we go." After the destroyer had berthed at Clavius, and the three entered the base, events went swiftly, if not smoothly. Scon talked to the entire personnel of the IP, told them what had happened. Then he went to his office and issued orders to have the arsenal cleaned out of all portable weapons. These were transferred to the 4 destroyers the Russians had assigned to Clavius as a token force. Broward then called in his 4 Athenians and Scon his 5 nationalists. The situation was explained to them, and they were informed of what was expected of them. Even Broward was startled, but didn't protest. After the weapons had been placed in the destroyers, Scon ordered the military into his office one at a time, and, one at a time, they were disarmed and escorted by another door to the arsenal and locked in. 3 of the soldiers asked to join Scon, and he accepted too. Several protested furiously and denounced Scon as a traitor. Then, Scon had the civilians assembled in the large auditorium. Technically, all personnel were in the military, but the scientists were only used in that capacity during emergencies. Here, he told them what he had done, what he planned to do, except for one thing, and asked them if they wished to enlist. Again he got a violent demonstration from some, and sullen silence from others. These were locked up in the arsenal. The others were sworn in, except for one man, Whiteside. Broward pointed him out as an agent and informer for both the Russians and Chinese. Scon admitted that he had not known about the triple dealer, but he took Broward's word and had Whiteside locked up too. Then the radios of the 2 scout ships were smashed, and the prisoners marched out and jammed into them. Scon told them they were free to fly to the Russian base. Within a few minutes, the scouts hurtled away from Clavius towards the north. "But, Colonel," said Broward, "they can't give the identifying code to the Russians. They'll be shot down." "They are traitors. They prefer the Rusky to us. Better for us if they are shot down. They will not fight for Ivan." Broward did not have much appetite when he sat down to eat and to listen to Scon's detailing of his plan. "The Zemlya," he said, "has everything we need to sustain us here, and to clothe the earth with vegetation and replace her animal life in the distant future when the radiation is low enough for us to return. Her deep-freeze tanks contain seeds and plants of thousands of different species of vegetation. They also hold, in suspended animation, the bodies of cattle, sheep, horses, rabbits, dogs, cats, fowl, birds, useful insects and worms. The original intention was to reanimate these and use them on any terrestrial-type planet the Zemlya might find. Now, our bases here are self-sustaining, but when the time comes to return to Earth, we must have vegetation and animals. Otherwise, what's the use? So, whoever holds the Zemlya holds the key to the future. We must be the ones who hold that key. With it, we can bargain. The Russians and the Chinese will have to agree to independence if they want to share in the seeds and livestock." "What if the Zemlya's commander chooses destruction of his vessel rather than surrender?" said Broward. "Then all of humanity will be robbed, will have no future." "I have a plan to get us aboard the Zemlya without violence." An hour later, the 4 USAF destroyers accelerated outwards towards Earth. Their radar had picked up the Zemlya. It also had detected 5 other unidentified space objects. These were the size of their own craft. Abruptly, the Zemlya radioed that it was being attacked. Then silence. No answer to the requests from Eratosthenes for more information. Scon had no doubt about the attacker's identity. "The Axis leaders wouldn't have stayed on Earth to die," he said. They'll be on their way to their big base on Mars. Or more likely, they have the same idea as us. Capture the Zemlya. And if they do, said Broward, we take it from them. The 4 vessels continued to accelerate in the great curve which would take them out away from the Zemlya and then would bring them around towards the moon again. Their path was computed to swing them around so they would come up behind the interstellar ship and overtake it. Though the titanic globe was capable of eventually achieving far greater speeds than the destroyers, it was proceeding at a comparatively slow velocity. This speed was determined by the orbit around the moon into which the Zemlya intended to slip. In 10 hours, the USAF complement had curved around and were about 10,000 kilometers from the Zemlya. Their speed was approximately 20,000 kilometers an hour at this point, but they were decelerating. The moon was bulking larger. Ahead of them, visible by the eye, were 2 steady gleams. The Zemlya, and the only Axis vessel which had not been blown to bits or sliced to fragments. According to the Zemlya, which was again in contact with a Russian base, the Axis ship had been cut in 2 by a tongue from Zemlya. But the interstellar ship was now defenseless. It had launched every missile and anti-missile in its arsenal, and the fuel for the tongue generators was exhausted. Furthermore, said Shaposhnikov, commander of the Zemlya, new USO have been picked up on the radar, 4 coming in from Earth. If these are also Axis, then the Zemlya has only 2 choices: surrender or destroy itself. There is nothing we can do, replied Eratosthenes. But we do not think those USO are Axis. We detected 4 destroyer-sized objects leaving the vicinity of the USAF base, and we asked them for identification. They did not answer, but we have reason to believe they are North American. Perhaps they are coming to our rescue, suggested Shaposhnikov. They left before anyone knew you were being attacked. Besides, they had no orders from us. What do I do? Said Shaposhnikov. Scon, who had tapped into the tight laser beam, broke it up by sending random pulses into it. The Zemlya discontinued its beam, and Scon then sent them a message through a pulsed tongue which the Russian base could tap into only through a wild chance. After transmitting the proper code identification, Scon said, "Don't renew contact with Eratosthenes. It is held by the Axis. They're trying to lure you close enough to grab you. We escaped the destruction of our base. Let me aboard where we can confer about our next step. Perhaps we may have to go to Alpha Centaurus with you." For several minutes the Zemlya did not answer. Shaposhnikov must have been unnerved. Undoubtedly he was in a quandary. In any case, he could not prevent the strangers from approaching. If they were Axis, they had him at their mercy. Such must have been his reasoning. He replied, "Come ahead." By then, the USAF dishes had matched their speeds to that of the Zemlya's. From a distance of only a kilometre, the sphere looked like a small Earth. It even had the continents painted on the surface, though the effect was spoiled by the big Russian letters painted on the Pacific Ocean. Scon gave a lateral thrust to his vessel, and it nudged gently into the enormous landing port of the sphere. Within 5 minutes, his crew of 10 were in the control room. Scon did not waste any time. He drew his gun. His men followed suit. He told Shaposhnikov what he meant to do. The Russian, a tall, thin man of about 50, seemed numbed. Perhaps too many catastrophes had happened in too short a time. The death of Earth, the attack by the Axis ships, and now, totally unexpected, this. The world was coming to an end in too many shapes and too swiftly. Scon cleared the control room of all Zemlya personnel except the commander. The others were locked up with the 40-odd men and women who were surprised at their posts by the Americans. Scon ordered Shaposhnikov to set up orders for the navigational computer for a new path. This one would send the Zemlya at the maximum acceleration endurable by the personnel towards a point in the south polar region near Clavius. When the Zemlya reached the proper distance, it would begin a deceleration equally taxing, which would bring it to a halt approximately half a kilometre above the surface at the indicated point. Shaposhnikov, speaking disjointedly like a man coming up out of a nightmare, protested that the Zemlya was not built to stand such a strain. Moreover, if Skon succeeded in his plan to hide the great globe at the bottom of a chasm under an overhang, well, he could only predict that the lower half of the Zemlya would be crushed under the weight, even with the moon's weak gravity. "That won't harm the animal tanks," said Skon. "They're in the upper levels. Do as I say. If you don't, I'll shoot you and set up the computer myself." "You are mad," said Shaposhnikov, "but I will do my best to get us down safely. If this were ordinary war, if we weren't man's, Earth's last hope, I would tell you to go ahead, shoot, but—" Ingrid Nashdoy, standing beside Brownard, whispered in a trembling voice, "The Russian is right. He is mad. It's too great a gamble. If we lose, then everybody loses." "Exactly what Skon is betting on," murmured Broward. "He knows the Russians and Chinese know it too. Like you, I'm scared. If I could have foreseen what he was going to do, I think I'd have put a bullet in him back at Eratosthenes. But it's too late to back out now. We go along with him no matter what." The voyage from the moon and the capture of the Zemlya had taken 12 hours. Now, with the Zemlya's mighty drive applied, and the 4 destroyers riding in the landing port, the voyage back took 3 hours. During this time, the Russian base sent messages. Skon refused to answer. He intended to tell all the moon his plans, but not until the Zemlya was close to the end of its path. When the globe was 1,000 kilometers from the surface, and decelerating with a force of 3 Gs, he and his men returned to the destroyers, all except 3, who remained with Shaposhnikov. The destroyers streaked ahead of the Zemlya towards an entrance to a narrow canyon. This led downwards to a chasm where Skon intended to place the Zemlya beneath a giant overhang. But, as the force sped towards the opening 2 crags, the radar picked up 4 objects coming over close to the mountains to the north, a battle bird and 3 destroyers. Skon knew that the Russians had another big craft and 3 more destroyers available, but they probably did not want to send them out too and leave the base comparatively defenseless. He at once radioed the commander of the Lermontov and told him what was going on. "We declare independence, a return to nationalism," he concluded, "and we call on the other bases to do the same." The commander roared, "Unless you surrender at once, we turn on the bone phones, and you will writhe in pain until you die, you American swine." "Do that little thing," said Skon, and he laughed. He switched on the communication beams linking the 4 ships and said, "Hang on for a minute or 2, men, then it'll be all over, for us and for them." 2 minutes later, the pain began. A stroke of heat like lightning that seemed to sear the brains in their skulls. They screamed, all except Skon, who grew pale and clutched the edge of the control panel. But the dishes were, for the next 2 minutes, on automatic, unaffected by their pilot's condition. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pain died. They were left shaking and sick, but they knew they would not feel that unbearable agony again. "Flutter your craft as if it's going out of control," said Skon. "Make it seem we're crashing into the entrance to the canyon." Skon himself put the lead destroyer through the simulation of a craft with a pain-crazed pilot at the controls. The others followed his maneuvers, and they slipped into the canyon. From over the top of the cliff to the left rose a glare that would have been intolerable if the plastic over the portholes had not automatically polarized to dim the brightness. Broward, looking through a screen which showed the view to the rear, cried out, not because of the light from the atomic bomb which had exploded on the other side of the cliff. He yelled because the top of the Zemlya had also lit up, and he knew in that second what had happened. The light did not come from the warhead, for an extremely high mountain was between the huge globe and the blast. If the upper region of the Zemlya glowed, it was because a tongue from a Russian ship had brushed against it. It must have been an accident, for the Russians surely had no wish to wreck the Zemlya. If they had defeated the USAF, they could recapture the globe with no trouble. "My God, she's falling!" yelled Broward. "Out of control!" Scon looked once and quickly. He turned away and said, "All craft land immediately. All personnel transfer to my ship." The maneuver took 3 minutes, for the men in the other dishes had to connect air tanks to their suits and then run from their ships to Scon's. Moreover, one man in each destroyer was later than his fellow since he had to set up the controls on his craft. Scon did not explain what he meant to do until all personnel had made the transfer. In the meantime, they were at the mercy of the Russians if the enemy had chosen to attack over the top of the cliff. But Scon was gambling that the Russians would be too horrified at what was happening to the Zemlya. His own men would have been frozen if he had not compelled them to act. The Earth dying twice within 24 hours was almost more than they could endure. Only the American commander, the Man of Stone, seemed not to feel. Scon took his ship up against the face of the cliff until she was just below the top. Here the cliff was thin because of the slope on the other side, and here, hidden from view of the Russians, he drove a tongue 2 decimeters wide through the rock. And at the moment 3 Russian destroyers hurtled over the edge, tongues of compressed light lashing out on every side in the classic flailing movement. Scon's beam broke through the cliff. The 3 empty USAF ships, on automatic, shot upwards at a speed that would have squeezed their human occupants into jelly, if they had occupants. Their tongues shot out and flailed, caught the Russian tongues, twisted as the generators within the USAF vessels strove to outbend the Russian tongues. Then the American vessels rammed into the Russians, drove them upwards, flipped them over, and all 6 craft fell along the cliff's face, Russian and American intermingled, crashing into each other, bouncing off the sheer face, exploding, their fragments colliding, and smashed into the bottom of the canyon. Scon did not see this, for he had completed the tongue through the tunnel, turned it off for a few seconds, and sent a video beam through. He was just in time to see the big battlebird start to float off the ground where it had been waiting. Perhaps it had not accompanied the destroyers because of Russian contempt for American ability, or perhaps because the commander was under orders not to risk the big ship unless necessary. Even now, the Lermontov rose slowly as if it might take 2 paths, over the cliff or towards the Zemlya. But as it rose, Scon applied full power. Someone or some detecting equipment on the Lermontov must have caught view of the tongue as it slid through space to intercept the battlebird. A tongue shot out towards the American beam, but Scon, in full and superb control, bent the axis of his beam, and the Russian missed. Then Scon's was in contact with the hull, and a hole appeared in the irradiated plastic. Majestically, the Lermontov continued rising, and so cut itself almost in half, and, majestically, it fell. Not before the Russian commander touched off all the missiles aboard his ship in the last frenzied defense, and the missiles flew out in all directions. 2 hit the slope, blew off the face of the mountain on the Lermontov's side, and a jet of atomic energy flamed out through the tunnel created by Scon. But he had dropped his craft like an elevator, and was halfway down the cliff before the blasts made his side of the mountain tremble. Half an hour later, the base of Eratosthenes sued for peace. For the sake of human continuity, said Panchurin, all fighting must cease forever on the moon. The Chinese, who had been silent up to then despite their comrades' pleas for help, also agreed to accept the policy of nationalism. Now, Broward expected Scone to break down, to give way to the strain. He would only have been human if he had done so. He did not at least in anyone's presence. Broward awoke early during a sleep period. Unable to forget the dream he had just had, he went to find Ingrid Nashdoy. She was not in her lab. Her assistant told him that she had gone to the dome with Scone. Jealous, Broward hurried there and found the two standing there and looking up at the half-earth. Ingrid was holding a puppy in her arms. This was one of the few animals that had been taken unharmed from the shattered tanks of the fallen Zemlya. Broward, looking at them, thought of the problems that faced the moon people. There was that of government, though this seemed for the moment to be settled. But he knew that there would be more conflict between the bases, and that his own promotion of the Athenian ideology would cause grave trouble. There was also the problem of women. 1 woman to every 3 men. How would this be solved? Was there any answer other than heartaches, frustration, hate, even murder? I had a dream, said Broward to them. I dreamed that we on the moon were building a great tower which would reach up to the earth, and that was our only way to get back to earth. But everybody spoke a different tongue, and we couldn't understand each other. Therefore, we kept putting the bricks in the wrong places or getting into furious but unintelligible argument about construction. He stopped, saw they expected more, and said, I'm sorry, that's all there was. But the moral is obvious. Yes, said Ingrid, stroking the head of the wriggling puppy. She looked up at Earth, close to the horizon. The physicists say it'll be 200 years before we can go back. Do you realize that, barring accident or war, all 3 of us might live to see that day? That we might return with our great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren? And we can tell them of the earth that was, so they will know how to build the earth that must be. 200 years, said Broward. We won't be the same persons then. But he doubted that even the centuries would change Scone. The man was made of rock. He would not bend or flow. And then Broward felt sorry for him. Scone would be a fossil, a true stone man, a petrified hero. Stone had its time and its uses, but leather also had its time. We'll never get back unless we do today's work every day, said Scone. I'll worry about Earth when it's time to worry. Let's go. We've work to do.
The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. First Stage, Moon, by Dick Hetschel. Originally published in Worlds of If Science Fiction, December 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. What colour's the sky? Still black as the place the devils throw their old razor blades. We'll hear it when we hit air. Pretty soon now. A few minutes yet. Man, my foot's working off at the knee. John awake? Hey John, you awake? How could I sleep through this? What d'you want? Nothing. What's she look like? Earth? Of course. A blue beach ball with a white halo around it. What's below us? Part of Asia, I think. Lots of clouds. I see India. Man, it's hot in here. Hell, wait until we hit air. We all awake? Anyone asleep? Say aye. Aye. No one's asleep. I heard 4 voices. If anyone can sleep through this, they've got my blessings. Woof!
my neck. You think you've got it bad. They've got me squeezed in with the camera equipment. I'm bent at the knees and again at the waist. Ah, but after we land. Ah, after we land. And if we land, of course. If we land? Hell, listen to him. He's still got doubts. Unchain that libido, son. We're men of the world now. Of 2 worlds. And speaking of worlds, we'll rule the world, gentlemen. For a day. Maybe a week. 3 rousing huzzas for us. Oops. Stand back there, son. These gentlemen just got back from the moon. The first men on the moon. The discoverers of a new world. Hell, Pop, I knew it was there all the time. We'll be famous. Our names will be on cereal boxes. The hell with it, I'm tired. Wish I could see out. What's it like? Same as before. I can see someone's leg and the back of someone's head. Damn this lousy intercom. I can't even recognize voices. What's it matter who we are? We're just a lousy pack of sardines till we hit Earth. Good old Earth. Hell with it. Gentlemen, I would make a speech. Also, the hell with you. I'm going to drown if I keep sweating like this. Shut up. I've got something more important to say than your groaning. If we must. The next speaker will be the Honourable... Who the hell are you anyway, bub? We have just visited the moon. Here. There's one more important thing we have to do before we land. You mean slow down? One thing to talk over. Look, Williams, I have a strong suspicion you signed on this trip for some reason beside glory, right? 'Cause Earth was getting too crowded for me. How about you, Wong? Needed a change too, I guess. Been breathing fresh air and seeing people too long. Got sick of it. And John? Well, I suppose I know what you're heading at. This isn't exactly a Jules Verne type trip to the moon, for the glory and advancement of science. At least it isn't to me. I got sick of science when I was studying for my masters. Sick of seeing what people were doing with it. I thought a few new worlds might ease the tension back on Earth, before everything gets blown to pieces. That's what I mean. A few new worlds to explore might slow lousy man in his wild race to the backside of heaven. New frontiers, new excitements. It's bound to tie people closer together in spite of their prejudices. But the glory, don't forget the glory. The patriotic zeal. Yeah, the patriotic zeal. I feel the same way you do. Here we're trying to bring the world closer together, and we have to do it in the name of the arms effort of a single nation. War Rocket Experiment 282Z. Well, at least we'll be able to say what we think, and we'll be important enough for a while so that people will listen to us. Yeah, when we get down, they're going to say, speech. They are that. And we are going to speak. Heroes for a day. Maybe 2 days. And people will listen to us. Not just America, the whole damn world. Show people a larger goal, one big enough for the planet, and all the little power goals will fall away fast. If we can say the right things, they'll have to listen to us. The US, Russia, all the little countries. Here she comes. I hear something. Atmosphere. We're back home. Crisis number 6. We can't fail now. Before it's too loud to talk, listen to me. When we land, don't say anything. We'll all get a good sleep and a bath before we say a word. Right? Right. Just give 'em the pictures and samples and demand a nap. Everybody ready for the final blasting? Here's where I lose another 2 gallons of blood. I hope we fall in a lake. I'm thirsty as a horse. Man, it's hot. 120 seconds. I'm not at all sure I can last this. That's straight stuff. Be ready to take over mine too, Wong, just in case. Hell, you'd better last. 60 seconds. Testing light signals. Are they on? Okay, here. Yeah. 30 seconds. Got your lights, Mike? Yeah. Mine too. This is going to be awful. 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2. Okay, here she comes. Well, man. Are we down? We sure hit something. We made it. Oh, God, we made it. We're back. Did we get back? Where did we land? Ocean. Atlantic. Well, break the hull. It's awful in here. Hang on. You may get a ducking. Air. Real air. Whoosh. Don't let anyone go and poison this air with cobalt bombs. Everyone here? Help Joe up there. That a boy. How's it go? Man, we're really here. Where's the reception committee? They were watching us with telescopes, remember? They were going to clear all ships and planes out of the area we were heading for. Remember, no speeches till we get a rest. Yeah, and then I know what I'm going to say. We can't do much, but we sure can do something. Stage 1, Moon. Stage 2, Earth. Here they come, planes. Look dignified. Man, look at that rocket out there. It's passing all the rest, coming down from above them. Looks practically wingless. It's going to beat the rest by a decade. Hey, it's black. Is it ever fast? What country is it? I can't see an identification. Say, it's going to pass us right by. Look out, it's diving. What's it dropping? Look out! Bomb, 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 duck!
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. If you're not subscribed, why ever not? It's free.